All right, so before we begin, I would just like to state for the record that today is December 8th, 2022, and my name is Ben Bauman, and I'm in Indianapolis, Indiana, speaking with Mike Murphy, and we are doing an interview for the Indiana Legislative Oral History Initiative. So just starting off, when and where were you born?
South Bend, Indiana, February 16th, 1957.
Okay, and what were your parents' names?
James Murphy, a native of Indianapolis, and Barbara Lill, Lill, native of Fort Wayne.
Okay. When did your family first get to Indiana?
The earliest, first I'm half Irish and half German, almost straight down the line. And so the first evidence we have, hard evidence we have, is the O'Connell side of the family, 1/4 of the Irish side. And we have my uncle has a family Bible that says this Bible belongs to Thomas O'Connell, Farmland, Indiana, 1850.
Wow.
So Farmland, Indiana is a little town near the Ohio border. I've never been there, but and then they eventually, that part of the family moved to what is now Lawrence in Marion County, but back then was called Lanesville.
Okay.
And my understanding is they made them change the name because there was already a Lanesville down in Harrison County. They didn't want the post office confusion or whatever.
Right.
So they bought one of the original lots in what is now Lawrence out near Geist. And eventually most of them were Irish railroad workers. And so there's an area of Indianapolis, it's not a hill, but it's called Irish Hill, on East Georgia Street, where all the railroads all kind of cross and all that. You can see this, where the core of Irish Hill is like Georgia and State Street.
Yeah, okay.
And they all live there, and my great-great-grandmother owned a boarding house for single Irish men on East Georgia Street, right where the Farm Bureau headquarters is now, just east of East Street.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And so they eventually, it's like the Jeffersons moving on up, eventually they moved east into Irvington.
Yeah.
Where there were, it was nicer homes, nicer whatever. And my dad lived in Irvington from when he was born to when he went off to Notre Dame.
Wow, okay.
And so, anyhow, so the four Irish names are Murphy, Lynch, O'Connell, and McGinnis. And then on the German side is Lill, Lill, Wessel, Graf, and I'll think of the fourth one in a minute. Oh, Richland.
Okay.
So
interesting. All right.
Yeah,
that's cool. Now, what were your parents' occupations?
My mom never went to college. She was the daughter of a doctor that had 14 kids.
Wow.
And next door to them was a family, the Oberfeld family, and they had 13. They had 27 kids between two houses. Pretty typical German Catholic family back then. She did not go to college because she got ruptured appendix and they thought she was going to die. And so she missed the window, so to speak. So she went to like a 2-year business college in Fort Wayne or something like that.
Okay.
And then was like a bookkeeper, but ever since she got married, she was a stay-at-home mom. And eventually, in her late 50s, became a suit salesperson at Hudson's in the mall in Mishawaka.
Oh, okay.
But and then my dad went to Notre Dame, left Notre Dame to go to World War II, joined the Army Air Force, got very lucky because he was a waist gunner and a radio guy on a B-17 bomber, which was frankly almost certain death. And they were waiting to go maybe North Africa to bomb, and took a test and came in first place, and they sent him to Yuma, Arizona for the rest of the war to be an instructor.
Wow, okay.
And then he, after that, came back and finished at Notre Dame, graduated in 1947, went to Northwestern for journalism grad school, and never actually finished his master's degree because he got the job he wanted. He worked for ABC News in the radio division and had a fun few years. He helped produce the first nationally broadcast election returns in 1948 at the Chicago Lyric Opera House, and it was the first time they connected the two pipes, so to speak,
Wow.
to bring the East Coast feed and the West Coast feed together. And then he was a producer for the Paul Harvey Show, which you probably know what the Paul Harvey Show was.
I think I've heard of it. But
He was one of the first. He was one of the first commentator talk show kind of guys, and he would mix in commercials with his news and all that, and very opinionated, very conservative guy. And I think his son does it now, maybe. But anyhow, this is late 40s, early 50s. Then my dad came here back to Indianapolis briefly and was the public relations guy for the national headquarters of the American Legion, which was just getting big because of all the World War II guys joining. And then he took a job at Notre Dame in fall of '52 and kind of started their public relations operation there, and it was there for 40 years.
Wow.
So, anyhow, retired in '91.
Yeah, okay. So that's a pretty interesting career then. How would you describe your childhood?
I describe it as pretty standard middle class. We had 6 kids, Catholic schools. Went to St. Anthony's grade school, St. Joe High School, Notre Dame, so it was pretty pre-planned, so to speak. We lived 6 blocks south of campus, walking distance, and I think that because, well, we had some perks because my dad worked at Notre Dame that other families did not get.
Yeah.
The campus was like a country club.
Okay.
For me, you had one major street to cross, and you had basketball courts and 2 lakes and a golf course and all that. It was just in the summertime. It was great when there were no students around. But academia did not pay well back then, and so we never, we had 1 car for 8 people. We didn't have a garage. We had no air conditioning in the house. We didn't have a color TV, and I watched the moon landing on a little 16-inch black and white TV.
Right.
We didn't have a color TV or air conditioning until 1976.
Yeah.
But there were other perks. The greatest perk was, I guess, that when you, if one of your parents worked at Notre Dame and you could get the grades and the SAT scores to get in, you went there completely free. And if you went to another school anywhere in the country at the time, Notre Dame would pay $1,000 a year of your tuition to go to any other school in the country. Well, back then, like Ball State was $1,600 a year, and Notre Dame paid 2/3 of it. So all 6 of us kids ended up with degrees from Notre Dame. In fact, the only other school I applied to was Hawaii, just because they had cool brochures.
That's hilarious.
Because I knew I was going to Notre Dame.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And when I was in grade school, every quarter when we get our little Catholic school report cards, we'd all line up, and my dad would tell us whether that was good enough to get into Notre Dame or not. It was the standard.
Wow, okay.
It was assumed we were going there, or we probably couldn't afford to go to college, frankly.
Yeah.
And so 5 of the 6 of us got bachelor's degrees there. My one brother was there 1 year and quit, went to Ball State because he didn't like it, but then came back and went to finish and did law school there.
Okay.
So Notre Dame was...
That's everything for your family then, I guess.
It was it.
Yeah.
In high school, I was a messenger boy for the ticket office, had a pass that could get me into the locker rooms and the press box on the field. My brother Pete, there's a guy, I don't know if you know this story about this, the movie Rudy, and the guy that...
Yeah.
Okay, well, so my brother Pete was his roommate the year he became famous.
Oh, wow.
In the basketball arena. They didn't live in the stadium like the movie says.
Right.
But I don't know if you've ever seen the movie, but he lived in the basketball arena with Rudy. And Rudy was a friend of the family, hung out at the house all the time. And my senior year, I lived in the same room. And we call it the ACC. Now it's called Purcell Pavilion or something like that. But I lived there free, and it's because I knew the guy who owned the building, or ran the building, I should say. And I called him and said, "Hey, is that room reserved for next year?" "No, you want it?" "Yeah, sure. Well, pick a roommate." And I got this friend of mine who's the son of a physics professor, and we lived there, for the senior year. Backstage for rock concerts, I got to work on all the stage crews.
Wow.
I could use all the facilities, for free.
Yeah.
Run it there at night, racquetball. I was in the Notre Dame boxing team for 4 years, and so I never even had to leave the building.
Oh my gosh.
Because we practiced in the building,
Yeah.
and I got all the free workout gear, towels, all that. I mean,
That's a pretty good deal.
It was a pretty good perk. It was a pretty good perk.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So I always tell people, if you want to understand my life, there's two things you have to not appreciate, but at least understand. And one is history, because I'm like a history crazy fool, and Notre Dame. If you understand, at least can put up with those two angles, then you can understand a lot about me.
Yeah, that's cool. Let's see. So, what did you know about your family's political beliefs growing up?
Zero.
Oh, okay. Wow.
My mom and dad, in fact, when my dad died in 2002 and I did the eulogy, I said, I never knew whether he was Democrat or Republican. He said, figure it out for yourself. I can guess, coming from a blue-collar Irish family in Irvington, that he was a Democrat. The rest of his family is all Democrat. They were very proud of being involved in some of the first national union sit-down strikes in South Bend and things like that.
Yeah.
And so they were very proud of that history. And then my mom told me that her dad was a big FDR Democrat until he decided to run for a third term, and he didn't think anybody should have a third term, and so he switched and became a Republican. So knowing how much she held her dad, put her dad on a pedestal, I assume she probably had Republican views. But again, they told us to figure out your own path.
That's
and
interesting.
So my brothers and sisters. Well, I have a brother that worked for 2 different Republican administrations in the White House, and now he's a big-time lobbyist. And then I have another brother who's kind of a crazy right-wing Trumper.
Okay.
And which I'm not. I'm a never Trumper. And then my other 3 siblings, probably more independent. They kind of go back and forth, between Republican and Democrat. I mean, they probably voted for Bush, but never would have voted for Trump, kind of thing.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting time politically for a lot of families, I think.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
So how did your awareness of politics change in college, or did it change at all?
Oh, it changed a lot.
Okay.
So when I was my first involvement in politics was as a little kid. There's a neighborhood called McKinley Terrace in South Bend. A lot of starter houses, built right after World War II. A lot of families with 6 kids and 2 bedrooms, everybody in bunk beds, kind of thing, And the first political memory, the first political involvement was going door to door, literally pulling a wagon, handing out brochures for a city councilman who everybody in South Bend was a Democrat. So his name was Roger Parent, and he represented the 4th district of South Bend on the city council. Now, my first memory of politics is I remember, believe it or not, when I was 3 years old, sitting on the hood of a car in South Bend watching Eisenhower go by in May of 1960.
Wow.
Sitting with my aunt, and what a big deal that was to see the president going by. And then the first book I really owned was Profiles in Courage. And my dad gave it to me when I was 7 years old, and I literally would read books like 7 hours a day.
Wow.
And they were always history books.
Wow.
And so I still have that book.
That's impressive.
It's on my shelf. I probably have 1,500 history hardcovers on my shelves in my house, and so
that's awesome. Okay.
Yeah. Anyhow, so then my second involvement in politics was when I was probably 17 or 18. One of my best friends in South Bend, her name was Fran Nemeth, and her dad was a judge, and her brother may have been a city council member, but Pete Nemeth, and he ran for mayor he was a Democrat and beat the Democrat incumbent Jerry Miller 2-1. And I had my driver's license, and they gave me some big old Cadillac, and I drove around and picked old ladies up and took them to vote. And I thought that was so cool. But in college, you asked about college. I was more into. I would go see anybody. So Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter. When the IRA came to town, to talk, I went and listened to them. So I was more into absorbing as much as I could. I planned to be a reporter. And so I majored in American Studies because Notre Dame doesn't have a journalism degree. I think they do now. I think they went back to it, but they had gotten rid of it. And so I tried to get a really broad education at Notre Dame. So I mean, of course, you have to take theology and philosophy at Notre Dame, but I took economics and accounting and astronomy, and I took all kinds of courses to try to give myself a pretty broad grounding in what I thought I would be someday covering as a reporter.
Yeah.
So I ended up voting for Carter, though. My first chance to vote for president, I voted for Carter. And then by 1980, I soured on Carter and voted for Reagan.
Yeah.
So.
Interesting, okay. And did your family ever comment on your political development at all, or they just kind of didn't touch it at all, or did you have conversations with them about your political development?
My dad was very proud of my involvement. And my mom, when I decided to go into politics, said she was afraid I'd lose my soul by being involved in politics because she thought it was inevitably corrupt. Mm-hmm. And so I spent, right out of college, the first 8 years or so as a television reporter. And I worked in 6 Midwestern states, but almost all of them were border markets. Mm-hmm. So I covered politics in Illinois, Missouri, and Iowa, all based out of one town, Quincy, Illinois, which is right where the juncture of those 3 states is there along the Mississippi. And then I covered Indiana and Kentucky because I worked in the Evansville TV market, but the TV station was across the river in Henderson. So I covered those 2 states. And then I worked, the last stop was in Grand Rapids, Michigan, the NBC affiliate there. And I was their political reporter for 4.5 years or so.
Interesting, okay.
So wow. I covered political conventions, I did everything. And I think that's probably what led me more to being a Republican, because the people I admired in politics were Republican.
Okay.
There was a congressman named Paul Henry who died very young at the age of 51 of a brain tumor, but he was real up-and-comer in Congress. In western Michigan, there were no Democrats in office west of Lansing except for one guy who was a state rep. His name was Tom Matthew, and he was a West Side Grand Rapids union official. Mm-hmm. But everybody else were conservative Republicans. Okay. And I think it probably kind of affected me or impressed me maybe. And then I was looking forward to 1988, trying to figure out what am I going to be doing for the election year in '88. I actually thought of going to work for one of the networks, not as the correspondent you would see on there, but one of the background reporters,
Yeah.
And I ran into a friend of mine who had played recreational soccer in college with. His name was Joe Zakas. He was a state senator from South Bend, and I ran into him at my old girlfriend's wedding in South Bend, my first love. He told me that John Mutz was looking for people. Well, I had covered John Mutz when I was a reporter in Evansville, and the only 2 politicians I really respected in Indiana politics were John Mutz and Dick Lugar. And I thought if I'm going to be effective, and I thought of doing this, getting into politics and then getting out and going back, and that would make me a better reporter.
Yeah.
So and Lugar already had his team. He didn't need me. But John Mutz was looking for people. This was in late 86, early 87. And so John Mutz sent Steve Carter, who eventually became the Attorney General, who was the Chief of Staff, sent him up to Grand Rapids to talk to me and my then wife. And they offered me a job. So April of 87, doing communications work for the Lieutenant Governor, but down here.
That's interesting.
I stuck with him 87 and 88, and then he lost to Evan Bayh, and I got into the private sector for many years.
Wow.
So anyhow.
So, what made you then want to get involved with the Indiana General Assembly?
Well, this is funny because as a kid, I always knew what I wanted to do. I mean, I was never one of these kids who drifted or, I don't know what I want to do with my life and I'm going to go to college and maybe I'll figure it out. Mm-hmm. I knew in grade school that I either wanted to be the mayor of South Bend or a television anchor.
Okay.
All right?
Those two.
Yeah. And the local television anchor from Channel 22 was a lector at our Catholic church. Roland Kelly, his name was, and he would get up and give the announcements and do all that. I was so impressed with him. And so, and then mayor of South Bend, I just thought it'd be cool to be the mayor of South Bend. And so I kind of had this 2-track thing in my mind. And I remember when I was in 6th grade, we had to present a concept, tell a story in social studies class. And I said, we should do a newscast. And if I don't get to be Chet Huntley, then I'm going to quit the team. And so we did it. There was a newscast back then. NBC was called the Huntley-Brinkley Report, and it was Chet Huntley and David Brinkley.
Right.
And so I did that, and just kind of continued to develop. And back, by the time I got in high school, the way to save the world was to be a reporter because that was Watergate, right? Bob Woodward, Carl Bernstein, the whole thing, and that was, reporters were held in great esteem at that time, and so I decided I was going to, I knew I was going to be a reporter, and just kept pushing myself that direction.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And
so when did you officially decide to run for the Indiana General Assembly?
So I left after John Mutz left. I went to work for Simon, the mall development company, and they were ironically one of the big funders of Evan Bayh's campaign.
Okay, wow, that's interesting.
And I went to work there and I started off in public relations, which I always technically was in, but I ended up doing a lot of work for the developers in the company. They had these mall projects all over the company, and all over the country, and I would go in, and I call it the right to build. I would go into a town and we'd figure out with the developer what the obstacles were to building a mall, and whether it was neighbors who didn't want you there, or environmental reasons, or endangered species on the land, or whatever it was. And I would hire a local law firm and a local PR firm, and we just kind of work over time to knock down all the barriers to get the right to build the mall. And so I really wasn't involved in politics for the first year and a half or so. And then in 1990, I decided to get involved. And I was living in South Side, Perry Township, where I still live. And I've owned the same house for 28 years. And I decided I had been the John Mutz's voter registration chairman for Marion County for 1988 during the election. And so I decided, okay, I'm going to get involved in Perry Township. And so I went to the Perry Township chairman. His name is Urban Merle, an old World War II guy, and who fought in the Netherlands, by the way.
Wow.
And I went and said, hey, first of all, I didn't trust young people at all. You had to be like 50 before they allow you to run for office, right? And I said, listen, I'll be your voter registration chairman. And he goes, well, come to think of it, I don't have a voter registration chairman, so I guess you're it. So I went to my first ward chairman's meeting in this little house on South Madison Street. This would have been late 1989. And sometime in 89. And one of the state reps, Gene Liu, who you ought to interview, said, I'm not running for re-election. And back then there were multi-member districts in Marion County, Allen County, and maybe in St. Joe County. So 3 guys represented one broad district, 156 precincts. And I came home and said to my wife, guess what? I think I'm running for state rep. There's an opening. So I jumped in, and back then we had slating, the whole slating process, which is a long explanation. But the idea was you had to get the votes of the precinct committeemen to move forward. And so I had a few opponents. a couple of incumbents, and then a legendary guy named Keith Buellin, who kind of reformed the Republican Party in the 1960s and still is thought of the god of Republican politics in the state. And I didn't even know who he was. I had no idea who he was. And so I started talking to people, and they said, well, what have you done politically? And I said, well, I worked for John Mutz in the State House. Well, that doesn't count. That's downtown, right? We're South Side, very parochial.
Yeah.
And plus, you're only 30 years old, and so, you're way too young. So, even though the governor was 32.
Yeah.
Right? So, I just decided if, I'm just going to outwork these older guys. And I did. And I lost in the very end in the slating convention. But I ended up just decided to turn things around and become the campaign manager, which bought me a lot of brownie points. So I became the campaign manager for the 3-candidate team moving forward. Mm-hmm. And then 2 years later, one of the guys who defeated me, a guy named George Schmidt, had already been blind in one eye, and on primary day of 92, he woke up and was blind in the other eye.
Oh my gosh.
And so he did serve one term blind. And he sat on the aisle, and his wife sat, and this is before all the internet stuff. He sat on the aisle, and his wife, Helen, read all the bills to him. And the Democrats were kind of mean to him because we had this room 336. We had to go up an iron stairway, and the minority always had to have the top floor, and the majority got the bottom floor. Mm-hmm. And they wouldn't, even though he was blind, they wouldn't give him a location on the lower floor. He still had to go up those stairs.
Oh my God.
Anyhow, so then I got involved in Marion County Republican politics because I realized you had to be involved in Marion County Republican politics to get to the State House. And the then chairman, John Sweezy, another legendary guy, county chairman for 22 years, he came to me and said, please don't run in 1992. It's just going to be all messed up. We've got a couple incumbents running against each other, and you would just complicate things. And I said, okay, I won't. And he said, but I want you to kind of grow within the party. And he said, I think in the way to grow in the party is to learn how to raise money. And he said, you got two choices. You can help me sell tickets at $50 a ticket for a dinner, or you can go out and sell foursomes for my golf tournament at $1,000 a foursome. And I thought, well, I'm not stupid. I'm going to do the golf tournament foursome. A lot less phone calls and a lot more efficiency, right? So I became known as a really good fundraiser. And then in 94, George Schmidt decided he couldn't handle being blind and being a state rep and all that. It was just too much. And so he came to me and said, I'm not going to run again. And Sweezy said, if you want to run, I'll clear the field because you've been a good team player, and I'm going to let you have the seat. So I was unopposed all the way through the process.
Wow.
And I won 8 elections in a row.
Yeah.
And stayed 16 years.
So did you have like a campaign strategy at all, or was it so clear that you didn't really have to?
Well, 94, it was the Gingrich Revolution.
Okay.
Right?
Yep.
And we had 16 new members of the Indiana House. 15 were Republicans and 1 was a Democrat. And so we kind of swept in. And then 2 years later, we were swept out. We lost like 10 people, and the thing completely flipped. We were, I think we're at 55, 45. This is my memory. You have to check the numbers. 55, 45 in the 95 and 96 sessions. And then we lost a bunch of seats, and I think we ended up, well, it was in 96, we had a tie, we had a 50-50. And so, but we were so cocky in 95 and 96 that we had a tie in 88, I think it was, and they had a co-speaker system, Paul Manweiler, who you also ought to talk to if you haven't.
Yep.
And it would have been John Gregg, who eventually ran for governor. And that worked okay, I guess. But in 90, so being prepared, getting ready, we thought, well, we're going to make sure that whoever wins, I think it was you have to check me on this too. Whoever wins the governor's race, if it's a tie vote or a tie in the House, the speakership will go to the party that won the governor's race.
Right.
Okay? And we had no doubt that Steve Goldsmith was going to whip Frank O'Bannon, and it turned out the other way around. And so John Gregg became the speaker.
Mm-hmm.
And through our own hubris, right? Which happens all the time in politics, you know. So I did 16 years.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a pretty long time. And did you have to do like a lot of like door-to-door campaigning at all?
Oh, I did every year. Even when I was unopposed, I did.
Yeah.
Because I thought you should be out there, and you can't take anything for granted.
Mm-hmm.
Even when I was unopposed, I thought it was building my brand,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's funny because when I ran in so in 2004, I became the county chairman also, which a lot of people thought was too much power in one person's hands to be a state rep and also be the party chairman.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, we just had the controversy on the Democratic side. Kate Sweeney Bell was a county clerk or whatever she was, and also the county chairman. So anyhow, so all of a sudden I started getting primaried, right? And I have an idea who put people up against me, but it doesn't really matter. And so in 2004, being a big history buff, I was always a student of Lyndon Johnson, because I think he's one of the two most amazing people in 20th century politics. Mm-hmm. He and Teddy Roosevelt. They just had personalities that were bigger than this building.
Yeah.
And Johnson would do anything to win. Well, when he ran in 34 maybe for the first time, it was a kind of a mid-year election, if I remember right. Or maybe it was 36. It might have been 36. But he was running against an incumbent in Texas. And what he did was he did yard signs that said Johnson Roosevelt. Mm. Even though Roosevelt had never endorsed him, everybody assumed that Roosevelt had endorsed him because he put Johnson Roosevelt on his yard signs and he beat the incumbent. So I stole the idea. Mm-hmm. And in 2004, all my yard signs said Murphy Daniels. Mm. And I was friends with Mitch Daniels, but I never asked him to endorse me. Mm-hmm. And he was running himself. But, all the signs were... And he used green and white. My signs were always green and white, and I joked with him that he stole my color scheme. But mm-hmm. They were always green, reversed out white. And so the guy that ran against me was just frustrated as heck because... I had used McDaniel's name on my. I said it's not illegal.
Yeah. What Mitch Daniels say?
He didn't care.
It's like, okay.
I knew him since '87. Yeah. We were kind of pretty good friends. Yeah. He's always been one of my 3 mentors in life. Yeah. And so he didn't care. He got a kick out of it.
Yeah, that's a really interesting strategy there. It's like give people someone they've heard of to make sure that they'll vote for you and connect you to that person. So.
Yeah. Just marketing, basic marketing.
Yep. That's funny. So what did you think of the election process overall?
Oh, I think, I think, Bobby Kennedy used to say this a lot, but this quote came back in the 18th century, I'm sure. It wasn't his, you get the government you deserve. Mm-hmm. And I really believe that. And with Trump, we got the government we deserved, mm-hmm. And with Nixon or whomever, with Clinton, it doesn't matter. You get the government you deserve. And I also think that I've seen a lot of my friends win and lose, and if they lose, they always blame somebody else. But I always say the candidate's responsible. You chose your campaign manager. You chose your this. You chose that. You were out raising money. Yeah. If you lose, it's your fault. It's not your campaign manager's fault. Yeah. So I'm pretty pragmatic, and I still have a reporter's bent to things. Mm-hmm. Not to jump too forward too fast, but I even now I'm on a weekly public affairs show that airs statewide on Fox and on CBS stations. Okay. And I'm known not only for being a never Trumper, which drives a lot of my Republican friends nuts, mm-hmm. But my goal is to always help people understand how the process really works and the influence of money and what issues really matter and what's really going to happen and how power works in the State House. Yeah. And I'm the only one on the panel that has that perspective. Mm-hmm. And so, I'm, like I said, I'm pretty direct and I'm pretty honest and pretty, straightforward.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's probably like one of the biggest issues, right? Is that people in general don't understand the process.
They don't. No.
So-
Oh, I used to get letters all the time. Dear Congressman,
Yeah.
can you
That's
fix
right.
my sewers? You
Yeah.
know, well, first of all, sewers
That's
are
right.
city,
Yeah.
and Congressman is federal. I'm in the beginning. But I will say that my reporting background always bought me. My perception is always bought me about a half step advantage with media because they knew I was one of them at one time, and I had a very open door policy with the media.
Yeah.
I think they're doing their job. I'm doing my job. I never refused to answer a question. I'd take their calls. They all have my cell phone number. I would help them understand politics. And even today, when a new reporter comes to town, like Caitlin Lang, when she first came to town, one of the first things I did was have coffee with her and say, listen, I don't want to be quoted, but I do want to be helpful. And so I will help you understand issues, the history of issues. If you need to, I keep a database of a couple thousand cell phone numbers. And so if you ever need to find somebody, I'll give you their cell phone number as long as you don't tell them where you got it, you know? And I've always been helpful to reporters for the last, 12, 15 years or whatever.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay.
And so it always has bought me, like I said, like a half step. Not that they're going to be, if I've done something bad, if they're not going to report on it.
Right, yeah.
But I've always had a little better relationship with the media than most politicians.
Yeah, I guess that is kind of an interesting background to have when you're coming into the State House. Most don't have. I don't think I've met anyone who really worked in media at all before going into the General Assembly.
Jim Shella, who's now retired, Channel 8, the legendary dean of the political reporters, I replaced him in Grand Rapids. So when he was coming to Indianapolis, I was going to Grand Rapids to replace him. And we had a lot of friends in common. We used to drink beers together. And,
That's interesting. So what was your reaction when you first found out that you won your election to become an elected official?
Well, it was mixed. I'll tell you why it was mixed, because I was very happy, number one. But my cousin that same year, Tim Jeffers, who's a Democrat, was running against Sue Ann Gilroy for Secretary of State. So I couldn't be too gleeful because I had to go to his election watch party and have some empathy for my cousin.
Yeah.
And he got his butt kicked, and I think he probably knew he was going to, but so I had to. I'm not into victory parties and things. I think they're kind of overblown, and and I went around and visited the different political. I always went when all the time I was in the State House. Every election, even if I was unopposed, I went and visited every voting location in my district, and I don't go to every one now, but I still insist on voting in person because I like to thank the people who are there voting or working, Republicans and Democrats, because it sucks and you don't get hardly any money. And so, but I would go to all the precincts in my district, and eventually, when we went into '94, we also were changing to single member or '92 changing to single member districts. So when I ran in '94, it was a single person district. So it wasn't the 156 precincts stretching all over God's green earth. It was Franklin Township, the eastern part of Perry Township, south of Thompson Road, and then a little bit of Warren Township. And I got very lucky because a lot of times in the party that controls, the party in the majority controls the redistricting. So what I did was I got very lucky because the guy, Eddie Mahern, who you also ought to interview, his brother was a state senator too, Louis. They're both alive still. So he had a district that came down. My district formed an elbow around the outside and was like 70% Republican.
Okay.
I mean, it was like, it was a dream district. And he could not hurt me because the Democrats' goal was always to push the Marion County Republicans out into the donut counties, their districts, so they would get primary opposition. Right? So he could not hurt me without hurting himself because I was on two sides of his district. And so if he pushed me out, he'd have to push himself further out too into Republican areas. Right? And so in the entire 16 years I was in the legislature, my district only changed by one precinct. And that was because I gave up a precinct to help Larry Buell make his district more Republican so he could survive. Another guy you ought to interview, So you'd see guys in these districts, they get redistricted, 75% of their district would be brand new. I mean, they would lose 5 counties, and pick up 5 new ones or whatever. And they had to get to know a whole new constituency, a whole new set of issues, whole new whatever. And they would get primary opponents because of that. Because somebody would say, well, he didn't represent me. Why should I, hold off running just because it's him, right?
Yeah.
I never had that problem. I was always in the same district, 60 to 70% Republican.
Mm-hmm.
So it freed me up because I was in such a safe district to be the Republican chairman.
Yeah.
And to do other things for the party.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what were you thinking like when you first walked into the State House, your first day in office as elected official?
Well, it's fascinating. First of all, it's really an awesome place. I mean, it's very impressive visually,
Mm-hmm.
and you kind of can't believe you're there.
Yeah.
And two things I remember from the beginning. Everybody gets the first days, you ever get your family pictures taken, all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But the two quick impressions I have is, number one, I just ran into this guy last night at the Bocelli conference, or concert, Ralph Foley, who I think you have interviewed.
Yep, I have, yeah.
I sat next between him and Gloria Gageline, who's now dead. She was from Fort Wayne. And Ralph said to me, the first thing you do is get up and walk across the aisle and shake hands with the Democrat, because someday you're going to need him. We're not always going to be in power.
Mm-hmm.
And best advice I ever got. And I spent 16 years in the legislature, 12 of them in the minority. I got more done in the minority than I did in the majority.
Yeah.
Because I had great relationships with the Democrats. And
Wow.
I could always convince them to let my little issue, not all the time, but, some things. And then the other thing I found out was really wild. I was walking around the back of the what we call the horseshoe,
Mm-hmm.
behind the speaker's dais, and there are a lot of pictures of old state legislators, right? And sometimes they would get their pictures taken, in a group or most of the times there were pictures of them sitting in their seats. And I looked and I started counting seats, and I realized I was sitting in the exact same seat my first term as my uncle was in his first term in the legislature.
That's spooky almost. Wow.
Yeah, and he was only in 1 year,
Yeah.
1 term.
Yeah.
I think he was in I think he got elected in 64 in the Lyndon Johnson sweep, and I think he was in 64 and 65, and then he tried to run for attorney general and lost, and he was out. But he interesting guy in his own right. He was a lawyer and ended up becoming a Catholic priest at the age of 55.
Wow.
Never got married. His name is Tom Murphy, my dad's brother. But he sat in the exact same seat that I did in his only term that I was there in my first term.
Wow.
Pretty spooky. It's like kind of weird.
That is like
makes the hair stand up in the back of your neck.
Yeah, that's one of those things where it's like starts to think there's some type of destiny or something.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Anyhow, so that was what I thought my first day. Otherwise, it was just pictures and
Yeah.
getting to know people, shaking hands with people.
Yeah, that's cool. So did you have did you feel like you had a pretty good understanding of the process before you came in as an elected official, or was there a learning curve for you?
Oh, there is a learning curve. I think it takes about 6 years to be a good legislator.
Okay.
And, again, I got great advice from friends. I had a lot of friends who were lobbyists. Just to back up a little bit, I left Simon in 92 and went to work for Anthem.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And I went to work for Mark Lubbers, whose wife became a state senator and
Mm-hmm.
eventually the higher education commissioner and
Yep.
all that. And Mark had been top aide to Bob Orr,
Mm-hmm.
and he was the senior VP of corporate affairs at Anthem. So I was pretty much surrounded by political people all my time at Anthem. And as you know, the legislature is part-time. And so when I was working at Anthem, Mark didn't really want me to run for the legislature. He said, my wife's already a state senator. She became a state senator in 92. And, everybody I count on is going to be, not paying attention to me, basically, right? And the CEO, who I'm still good friends with, Ben Lytle, who built Anthem from 1,200 people, one state Blue Cross Blue Shield company, to 50 Fortune 50 company, 14 states, all of them, except for Kansas. We lost Kansas when we tried to take them over. And the CEO came to me and said, listen, if Mark Levers gives you any more shit about being a state rep, I'll have you report to me. because I want good people to run for the State House and for other things. And so, not only as being a former reporter unique, I was the only member of the legislature who worked for a Fortune 500 company in a publicly held company.
Yeah.
And so I had a perspective on business issues and other things that other people had no appreciation of.
Yeah.
So
yeah, especially one that's like a healthcare company. So that's really interesting.
But I will tell you, because it's part-time, the conflict lines are pretty loose, and I always say everybody draws their own ethics line, and I try not to judge other people, but I refused to be on the health committee or on any insurance committees. And my standard procedure was if somebody asked me how an HMO worked, I'd tell them. But if anybody ever said, what does Anthem think, I'd say, go talk to the lobbyists. I'm not going to be involved.
Yeah.
And so I never worked in the government relations area. I always did public relations. And then I became chairman of the board of Monarch Beverage for 12 years, which is it still is, but not owned by the same family anymore, beer and wine distributor in Indiana. And I refused to serve on the public policy. I didn't want to be involved in anything to do with alcohol regulation or anything. So, and the reporters knew that. Now, some of the legislators thought, oh, Murphy, he's holier than thou. If he works for Anthem, he should be on the healthcare committee so he can help, policy-wise. I said, that's what they have lobbyists for.
Yeah.
And, but I think the media always respected that. And
I imagine.
And I never had a conflict. I never had to worry about that. And it made me a lot freer to be a better legislator, I thought.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Now, how did you keep track of the needs and wants of your constituents when you served?
Very well. First of all, everybody's assigned a legislative aide, and I was pretty obnoxious about that. I always made sure I had the best legislative aide in the State House, and I made them. A lot of legislators treat their legislative aides like secretaries, and a lot of them are female. Frankly, do this, do that, that kind of thing. I mean, some of it's I don't know what it's like now, but back then, bring me coffee, kind of thing.
Right.
And I always made my legislative aide an assistant legislator because I thought they were there to learn and to do real work, not just to shuffle paper.
Right.
And so when I came up with an idea for a bill, I would give them the bullet points, and I'd say, you go work with LSA and come back with a first draft. I don't want to have anything to do with this until it's in better shape, which made them somewhat competent, at least knowledgeable about how you draft a bill and how you put it together and do all that. And then they'd come back to me, and I'd look at it and say, okay, here's the changes, go back again. And it wasn't until the very end that I really even looked at the bill. My legislative aide did all the work, and they loved the fact that I did that because they were treated like secretaries to a large degree. And then then you also get a media aide. Yeah. And the ratio is different. Back then it was like 15 legislators to one media aide. They can't do much for you really. But I been in the television business for 10 years. Yeah. And 8 years. And your legislative aide, it was probably more like 4 legislators to a person, so they could spend more time with you. But I was always very aggressive about getting the person I thought was the best legislative aide. Now, media, you spent about the first 6 months teaching them how to write, usually, because they were notoriously horrible writers. Okay. But I found one, my best ever, was Stephanie Sample, and she was so good. I could give her some talking points. Here's what I want the release to say. Here's what I want to say, and she'd come back, and rarely did I have to change anything. She was so good. She was one of the few people, and it's very difficult for young people to understand the intersection between policy and PR, basically, and media. Sometimes they're good at one, not the other, but it takes but from a practical standpoint, you get a lot of mail. You get a lot of mail from prisoners. I'm really innocent, that kind of thing, Yeah. But what I would do is I would come home, and the mailman told me I got more mail than anybody in the neighborhood. And it was everything. Annual reports, all this stuff. And so what I would do is I would come home and literally grab my armful of mail, and I would stand over the trash can And I would triage, I call it triaging my mail. And I used to do this as a public demonstration. I'd go speak at conferences and say, here's how you do it. And I'd bring a stack of my mail. I got this yesterday. And I'd say, first of all, I don't read annual reports. Right? They're too bulky. I don't read them. Second of all, I look at the zip codes. If it comes, I memorize the zip codes obviously in my district. If it comes from a zip code in my district, it gets set aside for attention. If it comes from Gary, probably doesn't get an answer.
Yeah.
Right? Because I just don't have time.
Yeah.
And so I used to do that little talk to special interest groups to show them how to communicate with legislators better. Don't send annual reports. Don't send, this crap. Be very, very direct. This is what we want. This is, and have the communication come from somebody in my district. Because I'll meet with anybody from my district.
Yeah.
I'm not going to meet with somebody from Gary probably. And there were several companies. I remember AT&T one time. They did a mass, emailing thing on an issue, and they're all written exactly the same except for your name was in the top, but I got the same email that somebody else got. Yeah. And you just kind of dismiss those. It's just kind of stupid. It's a waste of time. And so I became pretty good at because I understood how I want to be communicated with in my public relations business. I have helped many lobbyists communicate with legislators better and be more efficient in their communication because I know what they will read and what they won't read.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And in terms of like how you utilize your legislative aid and stuff, seems like that's a much more beneficial way of going about it than having them not being able to help you with anything useful.
A lot of them, like I said, treated like secretaries.
Yeah, this seems like
they came there for a good experience, right?
Right.
They came there to learn, And
they can't help you much if they're just giving you coffee or something. So.
Yeah. The other thing I used to drive the legislative director, the staff directors nuts is when I'd meet with my first aide for the first time, I'd say, I was always very direct. I'd say, stay here 3 years and get the hell out of here.
Okay.
Because you can stay in government too long, and then you're unmarketable in the private sector. I said, well, if you can, IUPUI's 6 blocks away, get your graduate degree while you're here, maybe stay next year and get law school, take advantage of the opportunities around you, and then get out of here.
Yeah.
I tell the same thing to young people. My son, I say, go to Washington for 2 years, work on the Hill, get it on your resume. Yeah. People love this when they see it on your resume. They want to know all about your experience, but get the hell out of there unless you get your grad degree while you're in D.C. There's probably 20 universities in D.C., right?
Yeah, yeah.
But they didn't like it because they wanted everybody to stay 10 years, and that's a disaster for most people. You're young, keep moving.
Yeah. So, do you remember the first bill that you ever sponsored or authored?
I'd have to think about that. I wouldn't want to guess. But generally, I did 3 things. Almost all of my bills had to do with cutting taxes. One of my great missions was to get rid of the inheritance tax in Indiana, which I thought was a double tax. And I got rid of half of it while I was there. When I say half of it, I got an exemption back then for any estate under $100,000, which back then was half of all Hoosier estates. Yeah. And then after I left, they eventually got rid of the whole thing. Okay. But I did that. The other was getting rid of government regulation. I thought you should spend more time getting rid of laws than passing laws. And we did in 1995, I think, pass a sunset law that all regulations had to sunset every 7 years and had to be rejustified, which was a good thing, but it didn't work because the lobbyists were much more powerful than we were, and they were able to defend all the rules. The rules happen for a reason, right? Yeah. And so I did a lot of that, and then I always tried to write inequities. And it could be something like, for example, Bluff Road, which was outside my district, was still south side. There was a little boy, 12 years old, who was in his Boy Scout uniform. He went out to get the mail on Bluff Road. The mailbox is on the road, and got hit by a drunk driver who creamed the kid and went and hid in a cornfield for 8 hours until he wasn't drunk anymore, so they couldn't charge him. So there was a differentiation in the penalties. If you ran over somebody and left the scene, it was 1 to 3 years. Yeah. But if you hit somebody and you're drunk and you left the scene, it was 3 to 8 years. Well, he went and hid in the cornfield until they couldn't prove he was drunk, and he got the 1 to 3. And so I changed the law to even that up.
Yeah.
So it didn't matter if you left the scene of an accident after hitting somebody, you got the same penalty whether you're sober or drunk.
Right.
So I did things like that. But one of my favorite ones was Southport Little League. I mean, like a community center. I spent so much time at Southport Little League, and I still tell young people, best days of my life were being a Little League dad, helping coach and, working the concession stand and hang out at Southport Little League on Saturdays. And volunteer organization, right? Volunteer treasurers, volunteer everything. And it's a nonprofit. So there was a couple treasurers in a row who were supposed to file a certificate with a local township assessor to keep up their nonprofit, non-taxable, status. And she was kind of a bureaucrat. And she decided she was going to teach them a lesson and charge them all the property taxes that they owed. And it would have bankrupted Southport Little League. I mean, it would have owed like $26,000 and the place would have gone under. And so I got a call from the accountant who was, again, a volunteer. And he says, anything you can do. And rarely can you get something done retroactively. But I got together with the state senator at the time, who was chairman of the finance committee in the Senate, Larry Borst, who's now gone. But I put together a bill to give them a retroactive tax refund. And then I called the guy that ran the Southport Little League. I said, and things happen very quick in the legislature. I mean, 24-hour notice on a committee hearing, right? So I called the guy. I said, listen, I know this is where they know us. They're going to hear this bill tomorrow. And we're going to, and then actually was getting to the final vote, the third reading vote. And I said, I need you to bring me the 2 cutest Little League players tomorrow, 1 boy, 1 girl, in their uniforms with their mitts. And so he brought me this little 6 or 7-year-old girl with a ponytail sticking out the back of her baseball hat, and this little boy was a little bit smaller. And I brought them up to the front of the room. And had them stand right next to me, and I said, how can you vote against these 2 kids? Because I was a marketing guy, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of politics is symbolism.
Yep.
And, we got the 99-0 vote, and they got their retroactive tax refund. So I liked righting wrongs. Now I remember the first bill I passed. And I got in a little bit of trouble for it. But, and I'm a lifetime NRA member, okay? Mm-hmm. But I also think, you shouldn't be killing people with guns, right? Mm-hmm. And so there was a string of murders that had occurred. Marion County and statewide, things were kind of bad. And that was a time when people were starting to crack down on crime, when they started saying you have to serve a certain percentage of your sentence, and that kind of thing, which you still have to do under the federal system. But so I was a little bit into the drama and the marketing of ideas. And so Laura Miller was my first legislative aide. And so I had her get a roll of butcher paper. And I had her write down, probably with a Sharpie or something, the names of all the murder victims of the past year in Marion County. I think it was Marion County I did. And I got up there and I had her, when I was talking about, I had a bill to increase the penalties, to add 5 years, at the discretion of the judge, 5 years sentence on to any sentence for using a firearm in the commission of a violent felony. And I got the NRA to back it.
Yeah.
And so when I was up there talking, she rolled out the butcher paper from the front of the room all the way back to the chamber with, I'll say, back then maybe 120 names, who knows what it was. And I said, every one of these people, died because of a firearm, and it never should have happened. And the bill passed. That was my first bill I passed. But I did get a little bit of trouble because one of the Democratic legislators had a relative whose name was on that roll of paper.
Ooh.
And she got very traumatized.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, and
Okay.
how dare you do this? I wasn't doing it on purpose.
Right, of
It
course.
was just, I didn't know it was related to anything.
Yeah.
So I apologized. And that was it. But the sad thing is, I was just talking about this a few months ago, I cannot prove that law was ever utilized. I don't know that any judge, I never read any story where a judge said, okay, you're getting 5 more years. Now, you can do it on the federal level.
Yeah.
But, and I don't know, you know, I always say that, you know, it's time to leave the State House when they start repealing the laws you passed.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't know if that ever even got, I haven't looked back in the code. There was a major, in 2019, major criminal code revision. But I still have no evidence that that law was ever invoked by a judge. And it might have been used as a throwaway charge,
Yeah.
you know, that eventually got pleaded down or something like that, which I think is a wussy way to do things. But so that was the first one I passed. So I would do things like that. I always kept it to 6 or 7 bills a year that I would file because I thought that was the most anybody could manage. And what you find is that every party is for less government until they get in charge. And then they want to tell you how to live your life according to their philosophy.
Yeah.
And I had a friend of mine, I think you interviewed her, Pat Miller, who's kind of a tough old bird, you know, from the east side, and she shared part of my district. And she was a big, you know, less government person, and she would file 40 bills a year. And I'd say, Pat, and every one of them told you how to live your life. One time she passed she had a bill that was going to require every nonprofit, every Boy Scout troop, everybody to come up with a plan to how to keep kids safe in a storm. And I got up there and I was making fun of the bill, and I said, you know, I don't know about you guys, but I said, my mom taught me how to come in out of the rain when I was 2 years old. You know, why do you need a law?
Yeah.
And she was standing in the back of the room. I didn't know she was in the back of the room, and she started crying. She was like,
Oh, wow. Okay.
anyhow. Sometimes my humor got away from me.
I guess.
Anyhow, so the 5-year penalty was the first bill I passed, but again, it was almost always deregulation. It was cutting taxes or righting wrongs. Those are kind of the 3 areas I tried to focus on.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So how often would you say you had to work with the Democrats to get legislation passed?
All the time.
All the time?
All the time. And I'll give you an example. Probably the best example was, and you wheeled and dealed. That's part of the game. But after 9/11, everybody was frantic. You know what was going to happen to the world, to the United States, everything. And I went to the Democrat caucus chairman, Larry Grubb, who you ought to interview too. He's a member of the Alcohol and Tobacco Commission. He's from the west part of the state, great guy. And he and I decided that that 9/11 had exposed a lot of weaknesses in the state of Indiana. And so we came up with 10 bills that we called the Indiana Preparedness Package. And one of them included a constitutional amendment. And I can't remember everything that was in the 10 bills, but things, and we worked with terrorism experts and people like that. And John Gregg, who was the speaker, he used to always blow me shit. I don't know why. Now we get along fine, but he just to make fun of me, he'd always call me Marty. And then he'd always make sure I was the last person in the room that he recognized to speak on the floor. Now, I took that as a compliment. Right, he paid it. There must have been something he feared about me, right? And I was not a lawyer, and so the best compliment I ever got in the House, Jeff Espick, another guy you ought to interview from near Fort Wayne, who's was Ways and Means chairman for a long time. He came up to me one time and said, "Murphy, you're always the most prepared guy in the chamber," which I took as a big compliment because I had a lot of respect for him. And the reason it is because I took on a lot of big ideas. And whenever I got up, I was not a lawyer, and whenever I got up to speak, there'd be 7 or 8 Democratic lawyers lined up to rip me up. And so I had to be better than them. And a lot of them were pretty good, frankly.
Yeah.
And so I always went way out of my way to prepare. And the reason I contrast that with a lot of, and this happens in both parties, you get legislators up there who will bring a set of talking points handed to them by a lobbyist. Oh, and they'll go down the talking points, and as soon as you get up there and start to question them in any more detail, they can't answer the questions.
Yeah.
Well, you'll have to ask Joe. He's out in the hallway. Well, you're the legislator. If you can't answer your own questions about your own bill, why should we vote for this?
Yeah.
Right?
True.
So anyhow, I kind of got off on a tangent there. But, we're talking about 9/11. So John Gregg came to me and said, Murphy, I like your bills so much, I'm taking your name off of all the bills, and I'm going to put myself on as the author, which he had the right to do. And so they all passed under his name, except for he was nice enough to let me keep the constitutional amendment, and it passed in 2004. The voters voted for it in 2004. And what it did was, so I sat there and I thought, okay, there had been an incident in the Tippecanoe County Courthouse, where some guy pissed off drove a truck through the doors, and it was one of those courthouses where the basement was really the first floor, and you could drive down and you could literally, he drove a truck full of gasoline cans underneath the courthouse and tried to blow it up, but he didn't do a very good job. It started a small fire, and that was it. In fact, I don't think they ever caught the guy. And so I thought, well, if you come in the west side of the State House, you could do the same thing.
Yeah.
And it was before they had the ballards up there to block all that. It was just pretty open back then.
Yeah.
And once a year for the State of the State message, everybody in government is in that building in one room.
Wow.
The Supreme Court, the cabinet, all the state office holders. I said we could lose state government literally in a flash. Somebody could drive a truck bomb into this building and take out all the state government. Mm-hmm. And so I said we need to change that. And the succession order in the Constitution, I think it was Article 5, said that the governor, if the governor cannot serve, then the lieutenant governor cannot serve. And then if the lieutenant governor cannot serve, then the legislature shall choose who the governor is until somebody can be elected, kind of thing. Well, to me that didn't work, because you could take out the entire legislature, then who is going to choose the governor? So I decided to come up to mimic the federal succession order, right? And I went to Bob Garton, who was the president of the state senate at the time, brilliant guy. And he was very constitutionally oriented, even though I don't think he was a lawyer. And I went to get his help. He said, it's an idea. We hadn't thought about that. So he helped me form it so that, the succession order goes pretty typically, traditionally now. It went, governor, lieutenant governor, speaker of the House, president pro tem, like you would in the federal system.
Right.
But then I took it down to 6 layers. So even the state school superintendent is, in theory, is in succession to the governor. Mm-hmm. And he pointed out, the way I came about it was, I thought, okay, who would have the most knowledge of the obligations of state government? Mm-hmm. Everybody got taken out. I thought the Attorney General, because they have knowledge of all the contracts. And Bob Garton said, no, that's not right. We can't do the Attorney General. We can't put him or her on the list because it's not a constitutional office. It was created by statute. Mm. And we don't want to create a constitutional office with a tangential amendment. And so we took the Attorney General out. But we put in, auditor, treasurer, I can't remember what the order is now. And I'll never forget Todd Rokita, who never changes, by the way. Yeah. He hired a lobbyist to convince me to put the Secretary of State right up near the top. And I said, that's a ministerial office. I said, I'm not putting that. It's a joke office, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. I said, I'm not putting that up there. And he was so mad. Still hasn't liked me ever since. But it passed in 2004. Yeah. It's still part of the Constitution. So that's where I worked absolutely with Democrats. Then you'd work on smaller things. I'll give you an example. In 2005, I realized that we have one president from Indiana, Benjamin Harrison. There was nothing in the State House commemorating our only president. Mm-hmm. We had all kinds of other statues. Yeah. So I wanted to pass a law that said, that you had to have a bust of Benjamin Harrison in the State House. Yeah. And so I went to the Democrats, and they said, well, they would go along with it if I would put in the bill that there had to be an African American Hoosier Hall of Fame display somewhere in the State House.
Okay.
I said, sure. So the law passed. I got the Department of Administration to hire an Indiana sculptor.
Mm-hmm.
We used an Indiana. Everything was perfectly Indiana foundry, everything. And then I told the administration there was a bust of George Washington. You walk in the north door, where all the governor and all the legislators walk in that north door. Right when you go, instead of going right underneath the dome, you kind of go to the left. Most people do, and go toward the governor's office. And there was a bust of George Washington in this alcove. It was the best alcove in the State House. And I said to the Department of Administration, wait a minute, we already have George Washington on the lawn.
Yeah.
We're putting Benjamin Harrison in there.
Mm.
And so I got together the administration guys, and like on a Friday night or whatever, we moved George Washington up to the fourth floor, and we put Benjamin Harrison.
That's funny.
But we worked on, that was another one. And I knew that the African Americans the caucus would never agree on who should be in the Hall of Fame. It's never happened because they could never agree who should be a member of the Hall of Fame.
Okay, interesting.
So those are things you work with Democrats on, and kind of give and take, and they're kind of somewhat no-brainers, kind of no harm, no foul kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But you build relationships that way.
Yeah.
And Murphy's willing to work with us on this, so we'll work with him on that.
Yeah.
I literally got most of my stuff done. Now, the biggest bill I ever passed was telecom dereg in 2006. And I had a lot of Democratic friends helping me on that. And there were a lot of lies told by lobbyists, and we had to get all that corrected. But at the time, it was the most far-reaching deregulation bill in the nation for telecom. And it really blew open private investment in the state. And that's why, to this day, you talk to Bill Swords at AT&T, Indiana's always one of the first states AT&T invested in now. Because of that. And a lot of states took that bill. Even California took my bill. They changed a little bit.
Yeah.
Passed it. But it was the national model for several years. And Mitch Daniels used to say it was one of the three most important things that ever happened in his administration. But it took Democrats to help me on that.
Yeah.
I had Earlene Rogers, a black state senator from Gary, helping. And I had, and Matt Pierce, who opposes everything. Another guy you interview, though, because he's interesting. He was very much opposed to me. I'll tell you a funny story about that. Wynn Moses, who you ought to interview too, was the mayor of Fort Wayne for many years.
Yeah.
And he was a lawyer and very sharp. And he was after me. This was a racist bill. It was going to hurt black people. It was going to hurt the inner cities. By the way, he never lived in Fort Wayne when he was a legislator. He lived in Broad Ripple and sent his kids to Broad Ripple schools. True story. And so I knew he was going to make that argument. And I let him go, let him mouth off and everything for a long time. And then he's so proud of himself because he thinks he just screwed me big time. And then I pulled out a letter from the then current Democratic mayor of Fort Wayne. Said, Representative Murphy, your bill is the best thing that could ever happen to Fort Wayne. And it was Mayor, Moses was the former Democratic mayor of Fort Wayne, right?
Yeah.
And it just blew Moses out of the water. And he comes up to me later and says, that was good. That was really good. I was holding him back because I knew he was going to make the argument.
Yeah.
Quick story about Wynn Moses. The guy is so clever. You respect people. I always had more respect for my enemies than my friends in some ways because I had to be better, and I had to know them better, and so in 1980-ish, he pled guilty to, I think it was a felony, when he was mayor, some election rigging, some kind of election process. I can't remember what it was. And it was part of the plea, they pled it down to a misdemeanor if he would resign as mayor. So he said, okay, I'll do that. He lived next door to my aunt and uncle in Fort Wayne on Westover Drive. And so he's a very slippery guy. But once you know he's slippery, you can deal with it, right? And so he resigned as mayor and turned around and ran for the special election to replace himself and won. He said, I didn't tell the judge I wouldn't run again. And so he was back in as mayor 60 days later.
Oh my gosh.
Whatever.
That's crazy. Wow.
Clever son of a bitch. He's a friend of mine to this day. I mean, I could say he is slippery, but he's slippery like a fox, you know.
That's pretty funny. Wow.
Yeah, you ought to talk to him. He'll have great
Yeah.
stories for you.
So
Go ahead.
So in terms of like the relationship between Democrats and Republicans, what was that like when you served, and did it change over time?
It's changed dramatically.
Okay. And
So when I first got there, they had a party every year at the end of the session. They would have what they call a sine die party, and you'd bring your wife or your husband, and everybody get dressed up. It was like a high school prom. And it was very bipartisan. They'd have it at some hotel ballroom somewhere or something, or at the press club, which used to be in the basement of the ISTA building across the street, which I used to refer to as the world's largest steak and shake because the color scheme was like black, red, and white, you know. And so we went to it for a few years, and all of a sudden, fewer people were coming to it. And then at one point, the Democrats had a separate sine die party from the Republicans. And I kind of got caught up in that because what is now Prime 47 used to be called Moe's. That was one of the bars that all the legislators and lobbyists hung out with. And the FBI used to hang out there too to try to catch people doing bad things. So I thought that the sine die party, I didn't know that the parties had split the sine die party. And I went to Moe's thinking that's what the sine die party is. So I walked in, it was all Democrats. And I said, well, sorry, I thought this was, bipartisan thing. And they said, oh, Murphy, we like you, you can stay. So I partied with the Democrats all night.
that's funny.
And eventually I'm told they don't even have the sine die party anymore. Things have become so tribal, I guess is the word that people like to use now, that they don't even have it. It used to be, you could, and I guess just for some people it's still true, but you could argue like hell on the floor and go have a beer with them and go have dinner with them and their wife and, later and joke about all the bad things you said about each other on the floor of the house. One time, Caroline Mays, another person you should talk to, she ran the White River State Park, and she used to be the publisher of the black newspaper here in town, the Recorder. Sharp lady. And her uncle, Bill Mays, was the major domo black person in town forever and ever. Mays Chemical Company. And I actually was legitimately trying to make access to the judiciary for minorities easier, And there had been a program started by Randy Shepard, and he was the Supreme Court Chief Justice, to actually get black kids scholarships to law school because there's not many black attorneys in the state. There just aren't. And when you try to find a black judge, the pool is pretty small because there just aren't that many attorneys. And when I was state chairman, or when I was a county Republican chairman, I had that problem. And or Latinos. My God, try to find a Latino lawyer in town who's qualified to be a judge. It's very difficult, even now. So I had studied commissions and Harvard studies and all kinds of things about what to do. And I came up with this bill. It probably wasn't perfect. But the day I was going to present the bill on the floor, the Democratic county chairman, who was my competitor, Ed Tracy, held a news conference to say I was a racist. And then there was a guy named Larry, who still is around, and he comes to city council meetings. I don't know if he still comes to the State House. But he would, big black guy, really big black guy, and he would wear a Kentucky Fried Chicken bucket on his head, and he would wear a sandwich board. And that day, I was the honored featured person on the sandwich board. Mike Murphy is a racist, and Larry's walking around the State House with this chicken bucket on his head. And I think he still shows up at city council meetings. Well, I get up there, and Caroline Mays gets up there and just rips the shit out of me. What a racist bill this is. You're just repressing me like, everybody did in the 1850s kind of thing. It was not my intent at all. And the content didn't say that. But they wanted to defeat it. So I lose. And, in fact, Mitch Daniels called me down to his office and said, are you sure you want to push this bill? It's causing a lot of trouble. Why don't you just withdraw the bill? I said, no, I'll probably lose, but I'm going to push the bill. And so when she beat me soundly, I'm walking down the middle aisle with her, and she puts her arm in mine, and she gives me this big smile, and she goes, Murphy, you have to understand, when we're about ready to lose, we play the race card. And she had this big smile on her face. Don't worry, we're still friends.
Wow.
You know? And when she was at the White River State Park, she'd get me free tickets to any concert I wanted. And I mean, we were always good friends. We worked together after that. But yeah, I mean, she was very blunt about the whole thing. That's what we do.
Wow.
And we beat you, didn't we?
Jeez.
So that's part of it. I mean, but again, it's, you know, back to your original question, it's so partisan now and so difficult to work with people, and it's very, and I go to the State House maybe once a year. I try to stay away from there. But you know, my friends who are lobbyists say not only is it much more tribal, much more harder to work with people, but the self-interest has just become crushing. I mean, it's not good.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. So, did you witness like this shift when you were serving? Or?
Oh yeah,
Okay.
oh yeah, very clearly. Like I said, we start off with like high school prom every year.
Yeah.
You know, the spouses looked forward to coming, you know, getting a big meal and dancing and doing all that kind of. It's like it's high school prom.
Yeah.
And over time, fewer people, and it became separated. It became Republicans and Democrats separate parties, and then no parties at all.
So, what would you say caused that shift then?
Oh, I think to a large degree, I can't. I mean, I'm not a psychologist, but I think the overhyping of messaging that really had no basis in fact by both parties.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the personalization of politics. You're a racist. You're this. You're that. You know, a lot of it's social media. You know, it's easy, you know, websites and things that put out information is nowhere near the truth, but people believe what they want to believe and they hold on to things. And now you either watch Fox or you watch CNN, right? You know, I grew up in a family, my dad worked network news. We listened to the CBS radio news on the hour as we drove across the country. Would say, Dad, we just heard that an hour ago. Oh, we gotta listen to CBS News. Something could have happened in the last hour. You know, I grew up in that kind of environment. My dad read 3 newspapers, 4 or 5 magazines every week. You know, he said you read all kinds of sources. That's the only way you can make judgments for yourself, but people don't do that anymore.
Yeah.
They get on one website, whether it's Breitbart or, you know, the Daily Beast or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And that's all they read. And I have friends and relatives who are astoundingly ignorant about issues, but they're convinced that they know everything.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't, I mean, I know legislators who are like that. I won't name them, but I mean, you just shake your head and go, oh, Jesus, didn't you go to college? Yeah.
Yeah. What a world.
Yeah, it's worse now. I was at the George Bush, Mitch Daniels thing 2 nights ago, and a student asked a question about, I'm so frustrated because everything's so tribal. The Republicans are horrible, the Democrats are horrible. You're either far right or far left, and I'm neither one. And how do I? And George Bush said, this last election, November 8th, whenever it was a turning point because most of Trump, he didn't ever use the word Trump, never used the word Biden, but most of the former president's people that he backed lost. And that's a turning point. He said, but you can't despair, you have to get involved.
Yeah.
And he said, I don't care if you're Republican or Democrat, get involved, push your ideas, support people you believe in. That's the only way to turn things around.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting.
Anyhow.
Well, let's see. What would you say were the differences between the House and Senate?
Oh, I got in real trouble one time for calling the Senate the House of Lords.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I've heard a lot of people call it that, actually.
Yeah, but I had to go apologize to everybody because there were
Really?
senators standing in the back of the room and they were horrified.
Really? That's
yeah.
funny.
Yeah, so I had to go. David Long was the president pro tem at the time. I was friends with him. I said, okay, I fucked up. You know, I got carried away. And
Wow.
he admitted it was pretty funny, but. And I said, so how do I get back in the Senate's good graces? He said, just write a letter, send a copy of the letter to everybody, and give me a copy. So I did that.
Yeah.
You know?
Just for calling them the House of Lords?
Oh, yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So, but, you know, there's a reason, just like the founding fathers in D.C., you know, or in Philadelphia where they were, you know, one thing you learn about the House, and I guess it's true about the Senate too, and I learned this from a guy, Brent Steele, who you absolutely have to interview. He was a state House member from Bedford for many years with me. and then he was a state senator, and now he's retired. He spends half his time in Costa Rica. I always used to say, Brent Steele's a great American. I mean, he's the epitome of the great American in my mind. Small town lawyer. I love small town lawyers because, like Ralph Foley, because they see everything, they have to deal with everything, and they can't hide because they're law officers on the town square. They deal with divorce and real estate and business law and litigation. And they do everything, and so they generally have pretty good common sense and good judgment. I used to love to get involved with small town lawyers on issues. And when Brent Steele, my first session came to me and goes, well, that may be the way you think in Indianapolis, but that's not the way we think in Bedford.
Yeah.
And I thought, you know what? Brent Steele is absolutely right. And I became one of his best friends. And so what you learn is that the House of Representatives really is representative, with all the good things and the bad things about Indiana. You have funeral directors, you have teachers, you have farmers, you have just retirees, you have small business people, lawyers, you have every profession is represented. And 99% of them are good people. They're there trying to do the best thing. They may think differently than you, but 99% of them are there for the right reasons. 1% literally may be there to feather their own nest or to do whatever, which is true in any profession.
Yeah.
So, and again, I was never in the state senate, but I always had good relationships with the senators. I always had people I could work with, and I was fortunate that Larry Borst, who was the god of all finance in the Senate, and I shared half my district was overlapped by Larry Borst and half by Pat Miller. And Larry Borst looked out for me and helped me along the way to get a lot of things done that I never would have gotten done otherwise.
Yeah.
That's the big difference. I mean, the Senate is supposed to be skeptical of everything the House does. I always say, and this is really true, 80% of all legislation is based on emotion. It's all reactionary. Somebody got killed, so we need to pass a law.
Yeah.
Right? Some company went bankrupt, so we need to pass a law. Cincinnati built a casino, so we need to pass a law, right? Very little, only about 20% of the legislation is really forward-thinking, high-minded, so to speak. Most of what happens in the legislature is, and it's inevitable, but if you don't want to be in this role, you are in this role, and that is, most legislation divides up, is an attempt to divide up the economic pie and give somebody an advantage. For example, the easiest one to talk about is healthcare. So the hospitals fight with the doctors fight with the chiropractors fight with the physical therapists, right? And it's all about, I'll just use an example, between the chiropractors and the physical therapists. It's all about literally, in words in the law or in rule, who's authorized to twist somebody's knee. I mean, it's that gets down that low because it's all about market share. It's all about money. Doctors don't want physicians' assistants to be able to do certain things. Physicians' assistants don't want nurse practitioners to be able to do certain things. Nurse practitioners don't want nurses to be able to do certain things. And it never does it have in mind the good of the Hoosier population. It's all about who has market share. And it's disappointing, but it's human nature. And so again, healthcare is one of the easier ones and then the insurance companies fight with the hospitals too, right? And I worked for an insurance company. I witnessed all that.
Yeah.
So that and the emotion of, we have to pass this because, well, why? Because it's the hot topic, or because I don't care if it's abortion or if it's alcohol or, gambling. I always say gambling dominates every session.
Yeah.
Since 1993.
Yeah.
Even if there's no bills, because the gamblers are always trying to either get more table games, more this, more that. It's like the incremental process, right? You get your your nose under the tent this year, and next year you get your whole head under the tent. The next thing, the whole camel's in the tent, right?
Mm-hmm.
It takes time. But, and so, great example. I was in the legislature one year, and the company that owned, it might be Penn National, I can't remember. These casinos change ownership all the time, but I think it was Penn National. They owned the one in Lawrenceburg. And the guy actually had the guts to come to the Ways and Means Committee and say, you need to reduce, so you're always either trying to get more or be taxed less. That's the whole game in the industry, right? Mm-hmm. And so you need to reduce our taxation because we're up against these terrible people who have a casino in Cincinnati. Well, when you looked, it was their own company that built the casino in Cincinnati. They didn't tell the legislators that, and half the legislators didn't mind to bother to check, right? And so it's, again, dividing the economic pie, and so much is based on we want to protect our Indiana casinos from those bad people in Ohio. Well, there's no difference between the bad people in Ohio and the bad people in Indiana.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
There's a lot of hypocrisy. Rex Early, who just died a few weeks ago, he used to always say there's hypocrisy and then there's hypocrisy. Mm. And hypocrisy is worse than hypocrisy. And he was a clever guy. Anyhow, I'll give you the ultimate, and this is documented. I still have the roll call vote, just so if I'm ever questioned about it, I can call it up.
Yeah.
But in 2001, we had a special session. Frank O'Bannon wanted to raise, I think, the sales tax. And, of course, that was anathema to most Republicans, right? And Brian Bosma and John Gregg. John Gregg was the speaker, and Brian Bosma was the fairly new minority leader after Paul Manwater left. And he reached and they promised, and I ran against Brian Bosma for minority leader at one point.
Okay.
It was a three-way run between myself and Mike Smith, who you ought to interview. I think he's one of the two best legislators I've ever worked with.
Okay.
He's from Rensselaer area. He's retired now. He was an insurance guy. He flew his own plane back and forth. Fascinating guy. He was so effective. It was incredible. And the other guy, unfortunately, who was also my favorite legislator, is now in prison, John Keeler, who went to prison for working for Rod Radcliffe and playing games. Mm-hmm. But he was a really good legislator. And I don't know what caused him to do what he did, because he was wealthy and didn't need the money. I don't understand that. But anyhow, so we were told that we would go to caucus before we would hold a final vote on this idea. And Brian Bosma was trying to negotiate with John Gregg and Frank O'Bannon that we'll let you raise the sales tax if we cut the property taxes, that kind of thing. Some kind of evil bargain in our minds. And I was, when I went in there, I was one of the most conservative guys there. Now I'd be a communist because things have gone so far right. I mean,
yeah.
And so we're on the floor of the House, and all of a sudden the bill goes up on the board. Now, I'll never forget Brent Steele, who was a member of leadership. I declined to be a member of leadership after I ran against Bosma. I decided I was going to be a backbencher like Winston Churchill and just, throw grenades from the back row, so to speak. And so I was not part of Bosma's team. And so I never forget, I'm walking down the middle aisle with Brent Steele, and Jeff Espick is walking towards us. And Brent Steele is screaming at Jeff Espick saying, "You motherfucker, you promised me we weren't going to vote on this until, we went back to caucus." And Jeff Espick looks at him and says, "Brent, it's all over. Go back to your seat and vote." Okay? So the speaker has a way, when he stands up there, because the board's behind him, he can tell how the votes are clicking, right? 52 here, 40 here, whatever. And he can shut the board down when he gets the votes he wants, right? Because it's his prerogative to shut the board down.
Yeah.
So it was going back and forth, and it finally got, and John Gregg and Brian Bosma's lights were green to vote for the tax increase. Okay. And then when John Gregg realized that he had the votes, like I'll say 53 votes or whatever, he and Bosma both flipped their votes to red so they wouldn't have a tax increase on their record, and they sold their caucuses completely down the river. Completely down the river. Okay? Later that year, John Gregg and Brian Bosma are named Government Leaders of the Year in Governing Magazine. And we thought, holy shit, they're getting awarded for fucking over the entire legislature. And I don't know how many people noticed it. I noticed it. Brent Steele noticed it, a few other people. So fast forward, several years later, this guy named Greenberg from Governing Magazine calls me and says, I was working at Hirons at the time, and he calls me and says, you know, I'm doing a profile on Mike Pence. He's getting ready for run for lieutenant, or not, for vice president, and I really want to get a sense of who he is, and everybody says I should talk to you. So I said, yeah, you can come to me. And we spent like 2 hours shooting the breeze, and somehow the legislature came up, and I was telling him the same story. He goes, Mike, I got to tell you, I'm the reporter who wrote that story for Governing Magazine. I said, why did you do it? He said, I knew that it wasn't true, but my editors made me write the story. And he said, I knew what happened. He said, you're exactly right on the detail. So so there's a lot of hypocrisy. John Gregg, one of the sharpest, funniest guys you ever meet in your life, you know, once a year when he was speaker, he would come down from he spoke like an evangelical preacher. I mean, he could get the place rocking and rolling, right? And he came down from the podium once a year, and he would say, I can't be for the expansion of gambling because I couldn't face my church congregation in Sanborn, Indiana, if I did that, right?
Yeah.
The year after he gets out of the legislature, he makes $350,000 lobbying for slot machines in Pennsylvania. You know what I mean?
Wow, yeah.
Talk about hypocrisy. It had nothing to do with religion or values. It had to do with political survival and then money, right?
Interesting.
I could talk to you for hours about gambling and all the hypocrisy and the euphemisms that were, that were. That's a whole other topic. But it's and I just sit there and I'd watch it. Just try to be a good person yourself. You know, I mean, you can't run everybody else's lives.
Wow. Yeah, that's interesting.
Those are just two examples about hypocrisy, but there's a lot of it.
So I'm curious, shifting gears a little bit. I know you've talked about a little bit about lobbyists and mentioned them several times. Like, how influential were lobbyists in the General Assembly?
Well, I think most people don't like them.
Uh-huh.
My brother's a lobbyist in Washington, very successful. I think they provide a really needed element. They're like, in a stool, they're like one of the three legs of the stool. And the reason is because as a part-time legislator, I can't be expected. I have had a full-time job at Anthem. And I was lucky that I lived in the South Side. I got to see my kids every night. I worked the corporate headquarters just a block and a half away. In fact, when I came in the legislature, my first session in '95, I was so determined to be a good Anthem employee and a good father and a good legislator. This is the very beginning of the internet. And I had the IT department at Anthem put an antenna in the dome of the State House so I could get emails on the floor, which was like really revolutionary. And it didn't work very well, frankly. I mean, a lot of times it didn't work at all. But I tried, and I could actually get emails on my computer at the State House and try to keep up when the slow times, right, when there was not much going on there. And so contrast that with so many of my friends who left families and their businesses, and their law business would be ruined, and they'd have to go back after the session and rebuild their law business every year because people couldn't wait for legal representation while you're gone for 4 months, right? a guy named Mike Ripley ran an insurance agency up in Portland, Indiana, and had 5 or 6 kids. And his wife tried to run the business, and raise 6 kids while he was down here. And in some ways, it was a recipe for divorce. Vanita Becker, who's still a state senator, comes up from Evansville, 3 hours, whatever it is, from Evansville. And lucky, she has an understanding husband, and she's never had any kids. So she can live that life a little bit better. But another guy, I went through your list, I don't remember all the names, but Tim Brown.
I haven't interviewed now.
He's an amazing guy. He's a medical doctor.
Mm-hmm.
He's from Crawfordsville area, roughly. And he was a partner in a family medicine partnership and actually got pushed out of the family medicine partnership because he wasn't spending enough time practicing medicine. And he became an emergency room doctor instead, which allowed him to have more flexible shifts, work Friday nights when he got back to Crawfordsville and weekends and all that. But he personally may have sacrificed more to be a legislator than anybody I've known, as far as career success and all that. Now, my predecessor, George Schmidt, was a pension specialist at ILOHI. And I'll never forget, after I won the slating convention to replace him, he shook my hand and said, "Congratulations, you just committed career suicide." And because you're spending so much time, maybe a third of your life, outside the session too, doing legislative work, that a lot of employers get tired of it. In fact, I was so lucky at Anthem because they never cut my pay. A lot of employers would say, "You're not here a third of the time, we're cutting your pay a third."
Yeah.
Never cut my pay, never cut any of my benefits, nothing. Never penalized me a bit for working in the legislature.
Wow.
And that's not true for a lot of people. A lot of people, and then the other thing is, sometimes you would be a legislator and your employer would let you become a legislator, but you would never get a promotion. And then if you decided you wanted to go get a new job, nobody would hire you because they'd say, "Well, you're not going to be here a third of the time.
Mm-hmm.
We're not going to hire you. Nothing against you, but we're going to hire somebody who can be here full time. That's what we have We have full-time jobs here."
Yeah.
And so it was career suicide for a lot of people. I was so lucky. Again, I never missed my son's basketball games, football games. I may get there late. I may miss the first quarter, but I told my kids I will never miss a sporting event. And a lot of parents could never do that.
Yeah.
So think about your ultimate question. Lobbyists provide a very needed service in the sense that they, legislators come and go, the lobbyists stay forever, right? They're kind of an institutional part of the game. And they have information and access to information. The key is not to take everything they say and just swallow it, right? Because they have a self-interest. And so when it came time to do telecom reform, I was not a telecom expert. I would have been in the TV business. That didn't mean I was a telecom expert, right? And AT&T, they had this smarmy little lawyer who still works there, and his name is Brian something, and he wanted to be in LSA with me for every meeting I had while we're drafting the bill. I said, "Brian, you're a lobbyist. You're not part of the drafting process. I will have a bill, and you're welcome to react to it once there's a bill. And you can comment on it. We'll consider amendments just like we would anything other bill. But you're not my babysitter on this." And he was so pissed. He was so pissed. And if you're not careful, if you don't have a sense of yourself and your own, whatever, abilities, it's easy for legislators to just buckle under and submit to a lobbyist who, number one, is either a big contributor to theirs, and don't ever kid yourself, money does play a part, contributor to theirs, or has knowledge that they aren't comfortable with, or don't have the time to do their own research.
Mm-hmm.
I had a friend of mine when I was doing telecom. He spent a lot of his time down in the Supreme Court library looking up federal statutes for me and things like that. So I would understand the interplay between state regulation and federal. I was not an expert in federal telecom regulation,
Right.
by any means. And it took us 2 years to get it done too, by the way. So lobbyists play a very important role, and there are good lobbyists and there are bad lobbyists. And there's a saying in the State House that, all you have is your word. And once you're known to be a liar or whatever, then you're done in the State House.
Mm-hmm.
And the honest ones, the dishonest ones. And I could sit down and, this is not the topic of this conversation, but I could sit down and go down the list and tell you who the crooks are and who the crooks aren't. And I was the co-author of the 2010 ethics bill, which changed the whole direction of the State House.
Yeah.
With Pat Bauer, who was from South Bend. I knew him. He's from South Bend, a Notre Dame grad. And just between you and me, it's not just between you and me because it's history, but I decided to become the co-author of that ethics bill. I went to Pat Bauer and asked him to be the co-author, and he knew me and trusted me. He said, "Sure, yeah, you'll be the Republican co-author." The reason I did it because I knew that Brian Bosma would want that spot as the co-author,
Mm-hmm.
and in my opinion, there was no worse example of ethics in the State House, and I was not going to give him the platform to say he was Mr. Ethics. And so I grabbed the co-authorship, and then I retired from the legislature in 2010. I actually ran for Congress against Dan Burton and lost, but so I didn't have to live under the ethics rules that I created myself with Pat Bauer. But prior to that, it was the wild, wild west. I mean, lobbyists would have open bar tabs at Moe's and at the Columbia Club and stuff, and nobody paid for a thing ever. They paid for legislators to go on golfing trips to Scotland. Wow. Now, you had to report it, right? And
right.
The lobbyists, if it was over, I think it was $250. If it was over $250 expense, the lobbyists had to file a report with the clerk of the House. But anything under $250, a lot of legislators got pretty fat, getting free dinners. And I made my own money. And I would often say, hey, I'll pay for that. And a lot of times I would insist on paying for my own meal or paying for the lobbyist if we were sitting down talking. It's like, I was friends with a lot of them too. I wasn't going to be just siphoning their money away. I'll tell you a funny story. There were a couple legislators who were famous for going way overboard on the freebies. One was Joe Zachas. And here's a guy, evangelical Christian, Notre Dame grad, law school, whole thing. And kind of a lazy guy. I don't think he was ever a committee chairman in 30 years in the State House because I don't think he wanted the responsibility. But he loved good wine. And Jeff Linder told me the story. So Jeff Linder was the caucus chairman. If you haven't talked to Jeff Linder, one of the funniest guys you ever meet.
Okay.
He is hilarious. He was a sheep farmer and a city attorney in Shelbyville, and had a little sheep farm in Waldron, Indiana, along the Blue River or the Flat Rock, one of those two rivers down there. And God, is he funny? And he was very good mentor. And one time, because I have this crazy sense of humor, one time I filed an amendment to a bill that was going to make it illegal to put up Christmas decorations prior to Thanksgiving. Because I get so tired of, it's July and Walmart and everybody has their Christmas decorations. I want to make it illegal.
Prepared,
And he came to me and said, withdraw that amendment. I go, why? Because he says, you want everything you do is there forever. Mm-hmm. And you want everything you've done to be serious. You don't want, because you may think it's funny, but nobody's going to understand that 30 years from now. Mm-hmm. Who's this idiot that tried to outlaw Christmas decorations before thing. So he was a good teacher, so he was the chairman of the ethics committee. He was really, really, really rock solid, and he was very good at teaching you what to do, what not to do, how to be thought of seriously, how to do things in a good way. And you had to make sure and interview him. I'll tell you a quick story. He was so ribald in his humor. Mm-hmm. He became a lobbyist later for Ball State, and around the first female president of any university in Indiana, Joanne Gore, he would use the F word all the time. I mean, and she'd just say, well, that's Jeff. So he was speaking at a Lincoln Day dinner in Shelby County one time, and I was there, and he told the story about how, often guys from Indianapolis would come down and hit, like farmers like to show you their ground and all that. And he said, so I would go show him my farm, and I'm walking around the outlines of the farm, and we came upon a sheep with its head stuck in the fence. And he told this to a crowd of 400 people, half of them women, okay? We saw a sheep with his head stuck in this fence. And he said, I said to the guy from Indianapolis, do you want to show you what we do when we come upon a sheep with its head stuck on the fence? The guy said, sure. So he said, so I dropped my drawers and went to town on the sheep. And he goes, he said, then I said to the guy from Indianapolis, you want a little piece of that action? And the guy from Indianapolis said, do I have to put my head in the fence? He told that story. And the place, and that was his sense of humor. I mean, he was the most outrageous jokester. He ran for Congress and lost. I think he ran against Mike Pence in 1998 or so. I don't know what year it was. Maybe David McIntosh. But, God, was he funny. But you got to interview him. I don't know if he still has a house in Shelbyville. I know he lives down there in Jacksonville, Florida, or St. Augustine or somewhere, a good part of the year. Mm-hmm. But, God, he could tell you more stories. The most irreverent guy I've ever met. Anyhow, he's a wild man.
Let's see. How influential would you say gerrymandering was?
Oh, I think it's influential to a degree, but I can tell you, I'll go back to Eddie Mayhearn. Eddie Mayhearn was in charge of redistricting in 2001. Mm-hmm. He lost the 2000 election after he had designed all the state's district, including his own. It's a perfect example of how gerrymandering doesn't rule. It's no doubt that it has an impact. But all these people, we have to go to independent commissions. Mm-hmm. There's no such thing as an independent commission when it comes to setting legislative districts. It's all political, right? I mean, you can have the facade of an independent commission, but they're going to be influenced. So it's human nature. It's the way politics has worked since Eldridge Gary, whatever his name was, the guy that's named after, came up with the idea. It's just never going to change. Human nature, you can't take human nature out of politics, and you can't take the politics out of human nature. It's just you're never going to be able to separate them. So all these cries for Iowa-style commissions and all that, ultimately they don't work. We have big swings. I mean, for 16 years we had Republicans in charge of the State House. Then for 16 years we didn't. And then when Mitch came back in, for 16 years or so we have, maybe 18 years now. When we lost the election in 1988, there were Republicans in the governor's literally cabinet, Bob Orr's cabinet, who tried to claim they weren't really Republicans, trying to save their jobs. And they actually got to the point where they moved people's desks out in the hallway to give them the hint, get out of here, go. Wow, didn't matter. John Goss, who was on the transition team for Frank O'Bannon, my job at the time, I had 3 jobs actually for John Watts. I had an office in the Lieutenant Governor's office, I had an office in the Department of Commerce, which is where I hang out the most, and I had an office in what is now called Workforce Development. I had like 3 different groups of people that worked for me. And John Goss came to me and said, Murphy, you're a reporter for several years. We don't think you're really a Republican. You've only been out of TV for a year and a half, but we like you. We want you to stay on. And I said, nope. I came here to work for John Mutz. I'm walking out the door with John Mutz. I came to serve one guy, and he's leaving January 6th, and so am I. And I was kind of risky because I had one child and another one on the way. I had no idea where the money was. My wife was a stay-at-home mom. I had no idea where the money was going to come from. But you have to have enough confidence in yourself.
Yeah.
That you're going to get, things are going to work out. Always works out. And so the whole idea of the hangers on, all that. I mean, it's really true. It's just another phenomenon of state government. And get back to gerrymandering. It's always going to be there. I know I was going to tell you. So in '88, December of '88, there was so much wailing and gnashing of teeth among Republicans.
Mm-hmm.
Mitch Daniels, who was then probably running the Hudson Institute, said, he wrote an op-ed piece in the Star, which I still have a copy of somewhere in my house. And he said, essentially, we had our time, now it's their turn. And this is a summary of it, obviously, but we had our time, now it's their turn. And we will get our time again. And in the meantime, GOP should stand for go out in peace. And he was criticized heavily in the Republican Party for saying, let the Democrats rule for a while. What happens to both parties is they run out of ideas after a while.
Yeah.
That's why it's very dangerous. That's why Joe Hogsett's a friend of mine. I think he's stupid to run for a third term as mayor. Because by the time you run for your third term, you're on your C team, your A team is come and gone, your B team is come and gone. Hogsett said when he announced for mayor his first time, if I can't nobody should run for a third term. If you can't get something done in 8 years, you're doing something wrong. And now he's announcing for a third term. I mean, it's just, doesn't matter Republican or Democrat. You run out of ideas. Your agenda is petered out. It's time to turn it over to somebody.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting.
That's why Winston Churchill lost after the war. That's why, I mean, he'd served his role. It's time to move on with a different philosophy, different person, different whatever.
So thinking then about the legislative process in general, based on your experiences, what would you change about it if you could change something?
I would go back to being more bipartisan,
Yeah.
number one. That's, I guess, probably the number one thing, because I think what you learn if you spend any time there is there are good ideas from both parties. And I think, now this is probably, I'd be crucified for saying this in public, but I'm a big believer in split government. I think when, the old saying, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, it's absolutely true. Each party, if they control all three branches, if they control both chambers plus the governor's office, they get carried away. And they try to grab too much after winning, and just you watch this, what's Kevin McCarthy saying right now? Well, we're going to hold investigations. We're going to impeach Biden. Well, that's kind of stupid. Why don't you do something for the country, right? And the Democrats do it too. And so I'm a big believer in split government. Now, you could never put in the Constitution because that would violate all the other, principles of democracy. But I think we're always in dangerous ground, and that's why the courts are so important. John Sweezy used to say, Hitler gained power. Everybody thought Hitler was a nut. Hitler gained power because he corrupted the courts. And when the courts started, ruling in Hitler's favor in the 30s, that's when all, whatever, logic, reality, whatever, all checks and balances went away. And so the courts are very important to keeping things in balance so that one party, one administration, one philosophy doesn't get, carried away. I mean, if Todd Rickie were governor, I'd be praying every day for the courts. And he's just one example, but there's demagogues in both parties. There always will be. And the courts protect us from those people. So, but split government, if I could make it, wave a wand, I'd say, the House should be Republican, the Democrats should control the Senate or the other way around, which I know you can't. Trying to think what else. I think the ethics law generally was good. In fact, I would go even further than we went. In fact, some of my lobbyist friends agree. Kentucky has what they call a cup of coffee law. Because what happens is we made the ethics law by trying to compromise and do everything listened to so many people, we made it so complicated that lobbyists actually made money teaching other lobbyists on how to comply with the law. So instead of paying, say you take 6 legislators to dinner, instead of just paying the bill, you had to, under the new ethics law, you had to figure out, even down to dividing up the tip 6 ways, I mean, the reporting got so cumbersome. And I had lobbyists that say, just institute a cup of coffee law, which means you can't do any more than have a cup of coffee with the legislator. So you can pay $1.50, or not Starbucks, probably $5 for a cup of coffee, and that's it. Just cut it all out. Don't try to split the baby, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
I think on the ethics law we split the baby too much. So I would go to a cup of coffee law.
Yeah.
I would have term limits for chairman. I went to Brian Bosma, even though he was never a big fan of mine, and I was on the Public Policy Committee for one term. I asked Paul Manuel to take me off. We call it the Sin Committee because it deals with abortion, gambling, and booze, right? And this is before I became the chairman of Monarch, but I got off it. I just didn't. There's so much temptation in gambling. There's so much money. It's incredible. And I went to Bosma and I said, you need at least to have the Public Policy Committee chairmanship term limit so that people don't get so comfortable with the gambling industry, they don't get swept up,
Yeah.
and all that, and all the perks and all that. And this is again before the 2010 ethics bill. And he completely blew me off. But I have seen, not all, not by any means, a very small percentage of legislators do really unethical things, and some of them are still there, and just because they've been bought. When I left, after I left the legislature, several years after, and I don't lobby. That's one thing. I never want to be a lobbyist. I think most legislators are terrible lobbyists, and I just never wanted that to be my life. I want to have a life. I didn't want to define myself. A lot of legislators, they're there so long, that's all they know, right? And then so they have to get a job in state government, or they have to become a lobbyist to feed themselves. But several years after I was in the legislature, I do some PR work for lobbyists, as I told you, and help them understand how to communicate with legislators. And I got a call from a law firm here in town that said, hey, would you be willing to talk to a casino operator about doing some media relations work and stuff? And I said, sure. So I met with this guy who's the president of one of the casino companies, and he said, I said they wanted to put a casino potentially in at the Indianapolis airport. And he was talking about, the problem, trying to identify all the problems you would have. And I said, listen, everybody knows Rod Radcliffe's the big coon in the gambling business in this state. Have you met with him? Is there a way to do a partnership kind of thing so you're not like killing each other? He goes, I tried that. And he said, I went to, and again, I could have been an undercover FBI agent for all this guy. I've never met him before. I've only met him once in my life because I ended up not working for him. But he said, I went to Rod, and Rod said, I'm not going to partner with you. I don't need to. And he said, why? He said, Rod Radcliffe looked me in the eye and said, I bought the State House and I'll buy you too. And that was the attitude. And that's how John Keeler went to jail. And that's how, Brent Waltz went to jail.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it's just, now Rod, the only reason he has not been indicted as far as I'm concerned is, he's either cooperating somehow behind the scenes and selling his buddies down the road. I don't know what's happening. I'm not smart enough to know, but the same players are going to be involved in legalizing marijuana. That's the next big cash cow. Mm-hmm. And I say, I'm on TV every week. I say it every week. Of course we're going to go legalize marijuana. Maybe not while Holcomb's in office because he's opposed to it, but as soon as he leaves, the dam will open, and we will get legalized marijuana because there's too much money involved. The government cannot pass up the temptation to let it become legal and then tax the shit out of it, right? Use it for whatever. And the excuse they'll use, they always do this, well, Illinois does it. Well, Ohio does it, and all we're doing is losing revenue to them. So we need to have legalized marijuana here so we can get our piece of the pie. Right?
Yeah.
It's going to happen. And Rod Radcliffe, there was when vaping became a big deal, there was all of a sudden there was a decision somewhere. I was out of the legislature by then that we need to regulate vaping because we need to regulate the quality of the chemicals that these people are breathing in, right? To make sure they're not poisonous or whatever. And you can't make this shit up. So Rod saw vaping as a way eventually to control the legalized marijuana market. Because Ohio passed a law for medical marijuana, and there were only two ways to ingest it legally. One of those two was vaping. So he thought, if I control the vaping, then I'll control eventually the legalized marijuana market.
Okay.
So he had a bill put in by a legislator in Lafayette, whose name I won't use, but you could figure it out. One of these guys that Rod just owns. And he had put in the bill, there was a quality control bill, so you had to get your chemicals certified by a lab kind of thing before you could sell vaping chemicals in Indiana. He had put in the bill that in order to be a vendor or one of those labs or whatever, you had to have experience with overhead garage doors. I'm not kidding you. Because his buddy in Tippecanoe County that he wanted to use to make the money had been in the overhead garage door business. And the legislature didn't notice it or didn't care, passed the bill and became the laughing stock of the media because this thing was in the bill and they had to take it out the next year. But watch, if you're doing history, watch the future too, right? Because the future becomes history.
Yeah.
And watch how that plays out in the next 4 to 5 years. And it'll be the same people, same players will be involved. Rod Radcliffe will pop back up. He's been banned from the gambling industry, right? But he's still got $1 billion. He's a clever businessman.
Yeah. Interesting. Wow.
It'll be fascinating.
Let's see. So, going through some of like news articles and stuff like that, I saw that there was some legislation that was being talked about that we haven't gone over yet. That was mentioned during your time. Do you remember anything about like immigrant rights?
I was the leader of the my nickname was Amigo Murphy.
Yeah. So can you talk about like what is going on and how you got involved with that?
Well, so I got divorced in 2005, okay? And back up. So I was a vice chairman of the World Swimming Championships in 2004 when it came to Indianapolis.
Okay.
And I was in charge of marketing and sponsorships and things like that. And we had to go around the world listening, which was a lot of fun, and report into FINA once a year about how we were doing getting ready for 2004. And we went to Uruguay, to Punta del Este, which is like a resort area in Uruguay. And we had to report in, and I was trying my Spanish in restaurants, and I was so embarrassed. I could remember a lot of words, but I wasn't getting anything right from my high school and college Spanish. I thought, oh my God, this is a disaster. So I called the Latino Institute here in town or whatever and said, I want to come volunteer. And they go, well, why do you want to volunteer? I said, so I can learn Spanish better. And they said, wrong reason. Go learn Spanish first and then come volunteer. I said, that's fair. How do I do that? And there's a company called Berlitz, which was a language school that was founded by some Swiss guy in the 1800s, but it teaches languages like you would teach your son or daughter how to talk when they're 2 years old, right? Mm-hmm. It's not all verb conjugation, which is boring, which is the way high schools teach it. It's like, cup, pen, chair, and then you eventually put things into a sentence, then you put things into a paragraph. You learn like a 2-year-old. So I hired a tutor in 2002, and got pretty serious about getting really, I'm not fluent, but I just got back from Cuba and I did fine. You know, I could understand 80% of what they said, and they could understand 100% of what I said in Spanish, so I was fine. And I started to get really serious about Spanish, and I started vacationing in Spanish-speaking countries to give myself more exposure and a chance to practice and all that. So in 2005, I get divorced, and I had become friends with a lady named Juana Watson, who was Mitch Daniels' Latino affairs lady. She was a Mexican immigrant. She was from Columbus, Indiana. And by the way, Mitch is the only person ever to be governor and be fluent in Spanish.
Wow, that's interesting.
He won an award back in the 70s for being the best gringo Spanish speaker in the state of Indiana, kind of thing.
Wow.
Because everything he does full out, you know. And so he used to go to Gary, Lake County, to hold news conferences. And he would hold them in Spanish and answer questions in Spanish just to embarrass John Aguilera, who was a Latino, but was a gringo Latino. Like, he had the last name, but didn't speak a word of English. And Mitch would be answering all these people's questions in Spanish. And Aguilera couldn't even join. But, yeah. So I went to Juana Watson, or Juana Watson came to me and said, you know, Mike, I'm involved with a nonprofit called Friends of Hidalgo, and she was from the state of Hidalgo, which is the state east of Mexico City. The capital is Pachuca, the state capital. Probably, I'll say 60 miles east of Mexico City. And she was from a little village called Canali, which is up in the mountains, like, I'll say 2 or 3 hours north of Pachuca. So it's way up in the mountains. And you know, we go down there. It's not, she called it mission work, but it's not religious mission work. It was humanitarian work. So her group, they would use church congregations, would go down there, and they would, sometimes college kids from Hanover College or somewhere, and they would go to Canali, and they would build houses and, you know, do those kinds of things. And she said, you know, would you want to go? And I said, sure. Well, it was before I went on my first trip. But Eric Turner, who's another guy you need to interview.
I've interviewed Eric.
He's a great guy. And he had this incredible, nasty bill. It was either 1813 or 1318. I may be transposing my numbers, but that was the number of the bill. Sometimes you tend to remember bills, and bill numbers get legendary history behind them. Yeah. And I still remember a lot of bills by the number, you know, based on how contentious the voting was, right? And so they kind of carry a life of their own, the bill number does. And so it basically would have denied state services to illegal immigrants or non-documented workers, whatever you want to call them. And even to the point of no emergency room care, no state police protection, no child services protection, nothing, right? And first of all, the legislators pushing it didn't understand the difference between federal law and state law, because you cannot deny illegal immigrants emergency room care. You just can't. There's two things you can't deny them: emergency room care and a public education. Otherwise, you can deny them pretty much anything you want. And so I was sitting there you haven't interviewed David Young, I don't think. David Young's another legendary guy you interview. He's a great guy. I'll tell you about him in a second. But so I was his seatmate in the State House, and I said to him, you know, I gotta speak up about this. And he goes, you'll ruin your political career. Because one of the reasons was there was a national group called FAIR, and I can't remember what FAIR stands for, but it was started by a guy in Michigan named John Toutant, and he was the Stephen Miller of 2006. I compare Stephen Miller in the Trump administration to Joseph Goebbels. I think he even looks like him, and just the most evil anti-immigrant person you could ever meet in your life. And iFire was the Indianapolis version of FAIR, and they were founded at the Southport Library right in the middle of my district. Okay. And I decided I was going to oppose them. And I did a lot of research on the history of immigration law, and I won't go into all the details, but I got up there, and I never forget David Yount grabbed me by the arm and saying, "You shouldn't get up and speak, just stay in your seat." And I said, "No, I got to do it." So I get up there, and I gave about a 13 or 15-minute talk, and it was going to pass. I mean, it was a train had left the station, and almost all the people backing the bill were evangelical Christians. And so I went through the history. First of all, Indiana, you're not from Indiana, but Indiana has a pretty bad legacy of racism.
Yeah.
And I will go into a little bit of detail just so you understand it. But so in the 1851 Constitution in Indiana, this was an 1816 Constitution. They decided to redo it in 1851. There was an article in the Constitution that was referred to as Article 13. And what it did was, well, first was they knew it was going to be controversial. It was so controversial that they decided they had to they had to vote on Article 13 separately to ratify it from the rest of the Constitution because they didn't want to sink the whole Constitution. And what Article 13 did was it banned all blacks from coming to the state of Indiana, free or slave. So it wasn't just banning slavery, it was banning all blacks from crossing the Ohio River, essentially.
Right.
And it actually got more votes in Indiana than the rest of the Constitution did.
Wow.
Except for in 4 counties, which were generally the Quaker counties, eastern Indiana, northern Indiana. It was basically Richmond area and up that way. But the Quakers, as you probably know, were the first abolitionists. They were the first ones to file a petition in Congress to get rid of slavery. So I went through the history of slavery, and I talked about that, and I talked about being in, my family Irish, and some of them snuck over from Canada into New Jersey, So I said I come from a family of illegal immigrants to some degree. And I talked about the Chinese Exclusionary Act of 1888, which literally said in the federal statute that all Asian women were assumed to be prostitutes. Because that was after they just finished the railroads and the influx of all the Chinese workers, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they were tired of them. So they banned Chinese people from coming to the United States.
Yeah.
And then in the 1920s, for a while, they banned Italians. And every ethnicity has taken its spot on the bottom of the ladder, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now it's the Mexicans or Latinos. And so I talked about how because we were and we had so many lynchings and everything here in the state, and I said because we were such a racist state historically, we have an extra obligation to be on the lookout for tendencies within our culture to be that way. And I said, this is another one. And so then I decided to turn their Christianity against them. And I said, I don't judge anybody for their religion. I don't care what religion you are. But most religions have, I don't care if it's the Buddhists, the Muslims, they all have certain common themes, right? And so I read from Matthew 25, which is, I'm not great at my Bible, but it's where it says, I was in prison, you visited me, I was sick and you took care of me, I was whatever, and whatever you do for the least of your brothers, you do for me. And I stopped and I said, and Eric Turner was standing like 15 feet to the right, and God, these guys were so mad, the Republicans were so mad at me for doing this. And I said, how does this square with your Christianity? You tell me how this squares. And that's the way I kind of ended the whole thing. And the Democrats, every single Democrat stood up. I got a standing ovation for the Democratic side. The Republicans said to like this. And so I was like, I was persona non grata for a while. But we beat it. Mm-hmm. And we got, I can't remember the vote total, but I think we got like 74 votes against it, maybe 25 for it, and we completely flipped the vote. And David Wilkins, another guy you ought to interview, was actually one of Brian's best friends. He was a legislator from Warsaw. Mm-hmm. He's still around. And he came up to me afterwards and said, I've been here 30 years, and it's the best speech I've ever heard. And he said, he says, the only time in my history of here that I've seen one speech flip a vote. because usually everybody's decided by the time you get out.
Right. Yeah.
And 2 hours later, I was getting ready. It was like the last day before the flipping from the House to the Senate, and we get 3 or 4 days off, and I was going to the Virgin Islands just to sit on the beach and read books and drink some wine just to get away from the legislature, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I'd been recently divorced, and I was, you know, probably feeling sorry for myself. And so I got a call from Mitch. I was at the airport getting ready to leave, and he goes, "I heard about this speech. Do you have a copy of it?" And I said, "No, I didn't write it down. I just spoke from my heart."
Mm-hmm.
And he goes, "Oh shit, we got to find a copy of the speech." He said, "Everybody's talking about it." And then my legislator, they called me and said, "Murphy, I recorded the whole thing." So somewhere in my house I have a video of it.
Wow.
That was back when they were starting to record internet, the for action, but they weren't making it public record. They put something into law
Yeah.
or some rule that, you know, the media couldn't have it, kind of thing. And now they record everything. But so then I really became Amigo Murphy, and I became one of the leaders of the state of the Friends of Hidalgo. And for 10 years or so, I went there every year. With a friend of mine who's going to just got elected state rep, Craig Haggard. He's a great guy from Mooresville, former Marine fighter pilot and everything, just a badass. But it's funny because when Juana Watson asked me if I would want to go on these trips, and she said, you know, you can go with the Mooresville Methodist Church, you can go with the Hanover College kids, you know. And I said, oh, it doesn't matter to me. The timing's more important. I can go in July. So she said, well, that'd be the Mooresville Methodist Church. So I went, and I show up at the airport. And this lady comes out to me, and she goes, I hope you don't mind, but we drink on these trips. And I said, don't bother me. So we would work all day long. We did great work. We would, and again, I went there so I wouldn't have to make decisions. I just want to be a hod carrier. You know, I didn't want to be part of the architecture, and I wasn't qualified. But we would like do things like they'd live on these dirt floors, and the disease and the chickens would live in their houses with them because everything you valued you kept in your house. So the chickens would be shitting all over the place, roaches around the place, and we would dig out the dirt floor and pour like a 4-inch cement floor, you know, which was dramatically revolutionary for them and their families. We would do drainage projects. You know, we had one lady, she's 100 years old, and her house was built into the hillside, and the water would run down the hillside right through her house.
Wow.
You know, and so we did a water diversion thing, and we built her an outhouse, and, you know, things like that. I mean, some of the houses we built there was cinder block. Some of them weren't much better than you would keep a cow in here in the United States.
Yeah.
But it was life-changing for them to have a house with a roof. You know, it was a tin roof. And a door, we would jury rig a door with a wire thing for the latch, right? Because we didn't, you know, I mean, it's pretty simple stuff. But we did that for a long time until Mexico became so dangerous that nobody would go, no trips, you know. We brought, the governor of Hidalgo's name was Osorio Chong. He was half Chinese and half Mexican. He's still a big deal in Mexican politics. I don't know, it was Obrador or the other guy, or Nieto, when he became like a member of his cabinet and everything. And they came out to visit Mitch Daniels, and he brought like his entire cabinet. And I taught myself to give tours of the State House in Spanish, just so when they came, I could show them around. And one of the guys, Marcos Suberville, who was part French because of the French invasion of Mexico in the 1860s, he was the public safety commissioner. And 2 weeks after I sat right next to him and had dinner, he was gunned down once he walked out of his house in the state of Hidalgo because he arrested the wrong guy and pissed off some drug dealers.
Wow.
And so we couldn't get anybody to go down, so eventually we dissolved it. But in 2007, which I was proud of, I guess, is I got nominated for the Profile and Courage Award from the Kennedy Library or whatever, the one that Caroline Kennedy gives out. And they interviewed me, and they interviewed a bunch of people who were involved in legislative issues. But it was right that I didn't win because I took a lot of risk. But you know, I'm still alive. I'm still, you know. But the guy who won that year was the mayor of Houston, who, against his constituents' wishes, brought in thousands of hurricane victims for New Orleans and housed them in Houston.
Yeah.
To, again, his great political detriment.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a bigger deal, and he deserved it. But it was fun to be nominated for it.
Yeah, sure. That's pretty cool.
So that was it. So I decided to stand up, and to this day, I'm on the board of the Immigrant Welcome Center. And people, when they see me, what, a Republican, likes immigrants? How can that be? But I've been pretty committed to it for a long time.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay.
So. And Eric Turner and I still get along.
Yeah.
In fact, he came to me years later, and I fought. So Eric Turner came to me a few years later and said, Murphy, I will never admit this in public, but he said, my church, and he's a very evangelical guy, he said, my wife and I were assigned to help some of the poorer members of our congregation with household budgeting. Mm-hmm. And we got assigned a family of illegal immigrants. And he said, we sat around the kitchen table with them, we got to know them as human beings. He said, I will never vote the way I voted. I will never introduce a bill like that again, because I learned. He said, you were right all along.
Wow.
So, anyhow.
Yeah, that's really interesting. See, I also saw some legislation about like child abuse when you were serving. Do you remember anything about that?
Well, I don't know if I remember anything about child. Did I author it?
It was hard to tell from the newspaper articles.
What year would it have been?
I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. I think it was in 2000s, but.
Okay, I'd have to think about it.
Yeah,
Go back
if it's not like jumping into your mind, then it's probably not that big a deal.
The one thing I was really involved in that I was really happy I did. Again, I tried to right wrongs.
Yeah.
And Anthem, my former employer, had instituted a lifetime limit on artificial limbs to save money. Now, nobody grows up wanting to be, an executive in an insurance company. It's like nothing any kid dreams of. But for me, working for Anthem allowed me to do what I loved, which was do history. They paid for my history grad degree at IU, for example, to do history and to be in the legislature.
Yeah.
So it was a means to an end. It wasn't an end in itself. But so they instituted in 2007 or 2008 a lifetime ban on prosthetics. Well, so take the extreme example, a 9-year-old kid loses his, bottom part of his right arm to cancer, and as his right arm continues to grow, or his left arm continues to grow, and you have to keep up, right? Or else you can't play baseball, or if your one arm's this long and the other one's this long, you can't really do much, right? And that's what a lifetime limit would have at some point, he would have been out of luck for having a prosthetic device that worked or whatever. And I said that was bullshit. And so what was her name? She became, Julie Halvick was a lobbyist, and she became eventually Brian Bosman's chief of staff. Now I think she lives in New Mexico. But she was representing the people, the disabled people or whatever. And I decided I was going to take this issue on. And in committee, John Willey, who was the lobbyist for Anthem, because I knew him because I used to be down the hall from him, and he's trying to do the insurance company, the insurance industry line, so to speak, and we just can't have these runaway costs, and we can't do this and can't do that. And I said, John, Anthem, I think just 2 years ago, set up a department in California that sought out pregnant women on the rolls and went through their insurance applications, and when they found mistakes, they used that as a reason to throw them off the insurance, cancel their insurance even though they were pregnant. And I said, you got fined by the state of California $1.2 million, which I know to you is like a rounding error, right? And he, to his credit, he said, yeah, that did happen. And I said, so why should we believe you at all that, limiting the access to prosthetics is somehow a good policy, right? It's money. It's all about money. And it got pretty heated. And Julie Halbert came to me and said, Murphy, let's back off this. Nobody wants this. Leadership is nervous, all this. I said, sorry, it's out of your hands. I'm running this issue now. And I won the day. And I got the law passed that banned lifetime limits on prosthetic devices. And one of the things I did was, again, my marketing background, I brought a Purdue professor down. There was a woman. And she had been riding a motorcycle and somehow got in a wreck and lost both of her legs from the knees down. Mm-hmm. And I said, I want you to come down and testify. And by the way, I want you to wear a skirt, or shorts or something. I want them to see you walking down the aisle of the committee room with two fake legs. And this is before a lot of those fake legs became almost bionic, right?
Right.
And so we won the day. And Julie came up to me afterwards. She goes, I can't believe you got this through. I thought you were going to ruin your own reputation and ruin my reputation and make enemies forever. I said, but you still got to do what's right. It's not gonna change your obligations.
Yeah.
So that's on child abuse. But I'm trying to think what else on children I did. I told you the Bluff Road story. That's kind of involved kids. The other thing I did, and this is not child abuse, but there was a woman from South America who was a bank teller. And this was between 2006 and 2010. She was a bank teller in Lawrence, and a guy comes in to the bank, and right in the process of arriving at the bank, shoots her in the stomach. She was like 5.5 months pregnant. Well, she lost the baby, but they could charge him with robbery and aggravated assault and attempted murder, but they couldn't charge him for anything with a baby. And so I passed a law that said, if during the commission of a violent felony, even if you don't know the woman's pregnant, she doesn't have to be showing, she doesn't have to be 8 months pregnant, even if she don't know she's pregnant, and you cause the baby to die during the commission of a violent felony, you can be charged with murder for that as well. And that made national news because it got caught up in the abortion debate. And I'm pro-life, but I never got wrapped up in a lot of that stuff. I figured other people can make all those arguments, kind of, on that stuff you kind of spin your wheels, whether you're for or against, everybody argues past each other, nobody changes each other's minds. So I said, why get involved in the debate? But I did get involved in that, and it's obviously too late to help her. That's not one of those laws. I don't know if it ever had an impact. Oh, it did. I'll tell you why it did have an impact. Because years later, there was a Chinese woman named Bebe Shui, and she came to the United States from China, and she was dating a guy and got pregnant. And he wanted her to have, an abortion, and he wouldn't. They were engaged. He dumped her, the whole thing. Well, I don't understand the Chinese mentality, but she lost face basically, and she tried to commit suicide by drinking rat poison. Yikes. Which is a very acceptable way to kill yourself in China, but because of the EPA and everything, American rat poison is much less potent than Chinese rat poison. So it didn't do the job. She just got very, very sick, and she lost the baby. So she was charged with negligent homicide or something like that for killing her baby. And the prosecutor, who was, I think, Terry Curry at the time, so the murder, so it took a while for her to be charged, but anyhow, so I think Terry Curry was the prosecutor and charged her based upon my law. And Linda Pence took over her defense, and there's no tougher attorney in town than Linda Pence. She's really tough. And she decided to take it on for free, and was able to convince the judge to let Bebe Shui plead guilty to child negligence or something that would be a misdemeanor, because if it was convicted of a felony, she would be sent back to China. And she didn't want that to happen. So so I got involved because they were using my law that I passed, and I said, no, this has nothing to do with attempted suicide. It doesn't have anything to do with self-inflicted wounds. It's wrong to charge her with something that tries to prevent or disincent, so to speak, somebody from shooting a pregnant woman. In a violent felony. It's a completely different set of circumstances. So these two Jewish ladies from New York called me, and they said, we understand that you're involved in all this, and we'd like to interview you. We're doing a documentary on Bebe Shui. And I said, sure. And a lot of guys, Jim Merritt, who you ought to interview too if you get a chance, state senator, who one of my really good friends who thinks he's going to be governor. He's never going to be governor, but he's a good guy. And Merritt, Jim Buck, all these guys, another guy you should interview, all would run for the media. Nothing the media does, nobody with a camera can have anything good up their sleeve, right? And I said, well, shut it, I'll do it. So they interviewed me like 7 times, and they got the documentary done. They premiered it at some film festival in New York, and they invited me to come there. And it was kind of funny because it was in this neighborhood theater. They were spreading the film festival. I think it was the Tribeca Film Festival. But anyhow, I was there, and they introduced me, and everybody in the crowd, almost everybody in the crowd, were these liberal, very feminist, very pro-women's rights, pro-choice, pro-this, pro-that, and Bebe Shui was their symbol for a day, right? Mm-hmm. And then they have me come up, and here I am, this button-down conservative Republican, and they didn't even know how to talk to me. It's like this guy, Republican, was involved in helping. What they didn't know what to do with me.
Yeah.
It was hilarious. And they invited me to this reception, and I walked in, and like nobody knew even what to say to me, so I didn't stay very long. So I let them have their victory party, whatever. Anyhow, so that was, I guess, that about kids to some degree. But if you come up with it, I mean,
it was something about protecting kids online, on the internet from people I don't know, maybe child predators or something like that.
Well, it could have been. I was involved in a bill. Now so you're probably too young to remember all this, but Facebook was started by 2 guys from Harvard, mm-hmm. and you had to have a legitimate, valid college ID. My son was around in college when mm-hmm. Facebook started, so the average person couldn't get on there. Mm-hmm. But then there became a parallel platform for young kids called MySpace, I think it was called.
MySpace, yeah.
And it was pretty creepy. Mm-hmm. I was on the technology committee, and I don't exactly remember the purpose of it, but the goal was to protect. And I got on there. I did it very publicly so nobody would think I was a creep. Mm-hmm. But I said, let me show you how easy it is. And I talked to the state police and other people, and I said, let me show you how easy it is. I said, here I am, I'm whatever I was back then, 40-some years old, and obviously a white male. And I went on there and I signed up for MySpace in front of the media, in front of everybody, and I signed up as a 14-year-old girl. And I said, look how easy it is. We got to do something about protecting our kids from people who have bad intent. And of course, it's gotten worse and worse and worse over the years. And I don't even know if MySpace exists. It probably doesn't exist anymore.
I think it does still exist, but it's not like it's not used much. It's just kind of there.
Is it really?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's kind of like a living museum almost.
Yeah. That's I didn't know it still exists. But I was involved in that effort. I don't think I was the primary author of the bill.
Yeah, I think you were just mentioned. Someone mentioned you about it.
Yeah, but that was on the technology committee. I was not the chairman at the time. Mm-hmm. But I was interested in protecting kids. I mean, I had kids, and you never know what kids are doing.
Yeah. Well, so why did you end up leaving the Indiana General Assembly?
Well, for 2 reasons. One, I joked earlier in our conversation about, it's time to leave when they start repealing laws you passed. There's a finite, useful life. I had seen some of my friends, Bob Garten and Larry Borst, stellar careers in the legislature, like legendary legislators, after 35, 36 years be pushed out, you know? And we always say there's 3 ways to leave the legislature, and 2 of them are bad. You get defeated or you die, right? So I've always been somebody, I've always believed, and I tell young people this all the time, there's very few times in your life when you can control your own destiny. And when that door opens, you have an obligation to walk through it. And literally it could be a handful of times in your life. I can remember those times. Like deciding I was going to leave instead of stay with the Democrats, right? Mm-hmm. And those are life-changing decisions. Who you marry, another one, you know. So I thought I had reached the point where I'd done what I could do or wanted to do, and I was ready to leave. And Dan Burton, who was a crazy son of a bitch congressman, who I could go on for hours about him, but he was the guy who was the chairman of the House Oversight Committee during the Clinton impeachment. And he was convinced that, you may have to look some of this up, but Vince Foster, who was a friend of the Clintons and was, you know, I guess committed suicide in a park along the Potomac River. There were a lot of people that thought that Hillary had him knocked off because he knew too much about, you know, Whitewater and all the Clinton corruption. And so just to show how crazy Dan Burton was, he went out in his backyard and fired a high-powered rifle into a watermelon to prove somehow that the splatter of the watermelon guts was similar to the brain splatter when you fire a high-powered rifle at somebody's head. And I mean, he was just off the charts crazy. And he was one of these guys, a lot like Todd Rokita. I call Todd Rokita the young Dan Burton because Dan Burton was a lot like him. Any issue, he would be the first one to hold a news conference, the first one out of public press release, even if it was not even connected to his district or anything. He would always be one to rush to the cameras. And he was a good quote. He was crazy. So I decided, you know, I'm ready to get out of the legislature. I think I'm going to run, you know, I'm going to run against Dan Burton. And Dan Burton had already been in for 20 years. And Dan Burton was a devious, dangerous guy in a lot of ways. I mean, if you ran against him, he would have your kids followed home from school. He would do anything to win. And, well, what happened was, this was in 2010, a lot of other people had the same idea. So we had 7 people in that race.
Wow.
6 opponents, all white males. The worst thing was 4 of us had last names that began with M. So we just and Dan Burton wins the primary with 28% of the vote. You know, I thought, boy, that was the stupidest thing I ever did. But I learned a lot, made a lot of good friends, learned a lot of life lessons. You know, you know, I didn't regret a minute of it. And then after that, I had lunch with John Keeler, who now is in prison, and I said to him, John, I'm trying to think what to do next. Should I go back in the corporate world or do a client-based business? He goes, Murphy, at that time, he says, you're 52 years old. He said, they can fire you for wearing a purple shirt to work. I mean, there's no laws in Indiana that protect you. Go in the client-based business, because then as long as you have your health, you can work until you're 80 if you want. And that's how I got into the client-based business, was listening to John Keeler. Which circles back around, I'm so disappointed that he ended up doing what he did. Because he was such a sharp guy, and he didn't need any money. But anyway, it's another story.
Let's see, last, I guess, few questions here then. What advice would you give to future legislators or even current legislators?
Well, I guess there's practical and there's philosophical things.
Yeah.
Practical things, know the rules. One thing I was told when I went in, the guy who knows the rules the best wins, and it's absolutely true. You can use the rules to defeat your enemies because most people are too lazy to learn the rules of their own chamber. And so I became an expert on the rules. And at one point I was the ranking member of the Rules Committee, and I knew the rules backwards and forwards, and I used those all the time to win, you know, procedural battles. So know the rules. That's why one of the first things I told Craig Hager, I helped him win his campaign. I said, there's 2 books you need. You need a rule book before anybody else gives it to you, go get one. They're public record. And there's also a little, it's not bound, but it's got the wire spine to it.
Yeah.
Where every year or two, they publish a new version, and it tells you every tax, every revenue source of Indiana and where it goes to, how it gets split up. I said, if you know that, those 2 books, then you're going to be a really good legislator. So that's one. But philosophically, be your own person. There's a lot worse things than being defeated, and losing your reputation is the worst. Because once you lose your reputation in the State House, you're done. You can never recover it. And it's the one thing everybody in life should care about, right? Is their reputation. And no ambition is worth losing your reputation over. And I think a lot of people get caught up. A lot of people ruin their marriages. A lot of people, because their wife and their wives and their husbands get caught up in relationships and have affairs, and it really alters her life. And that's a whole other chapter of things I could talk to you about. But Jim Shelley, the guy we talked about earlier, said that when he retired, he hasn't done it, but he said, when I retire from reporting, I'm going to write a book, and that book is going to be about all the State House scandals. And the title is going to be Yes, But Not in the State House. Because Evan Bayh's, the first lottery office was in the State House. And the first lottery director's name was Jack Crawford, and he had an African-American woman working for him. I don't remember her last name. Her first name was Mary. And he asked her to sleep with him, and she said, yes, but not in the State House. And Evan Bayh fired the guy when everybody found out about it, and he's now a defense lawyer somewhere. But I've known guys who've had 5-6 kids, and they're 3 hours from home, and they get caught up with a cute legislative aide, and it destroys their life. And so, none of that's worth it. And there's a lot of temptation. There's temptation here. There's temptation in Washington, and this plays out more on the public stage because you're more public, and there's those temptations probably in any industry, right? But I think it's never worth it. And I've never understood why young women, 19, 20 years old, become infatuated with some fat old white guy in the legislature because they think he's powerful. Well, come on, you're not powerful.
Yeah.
But that happens all the time. I've known
Yeah.
legislators who've married their legislative aides.
Wow. Okay.
And some of them turn out to be successful marriages. Some of them, I know one of them was married for 20 or 30 years to his legislative aide, and I guess still is. But I've seen a lot of heartache, and it's always the guys who wear their religion on their sleeve the most who are hiding something. Always. And if somebody gets too preachy at the microphone, or somebody spends too much time trying to brag about how good their marriage is, then you wonder, what's going on in the background? It's a cynical way to approach things, but it's true.
Well, yeah, I guess, psychologically, people, tend to want to show you what they want you to see, so...
I always say in politics, you are what you say you are until somebody proves you differently.
Yeah.
And it's really true.
Yeah.
And so, again, I want to get into names and things, but there's some legendary stories, which you could write a book about. In fact, Caitlin Lang, who just left the Star, she's a great young lady, and I talked about her earlier. She graduated from Ball State, great reporter. And she called me and told me that she and Ryan Martin, who was on one of the Pulitzer Prize-winning teams for the Star, were leaving to join a new online news service. And she said, it's going to be called State Affairs. I said, well, that's good. I said, I'm glad you didn't name it State House Affairs, because I said you'd have too much to write about. She got a kick out of that. But, it's nobody, people figure this out. And some of it you can laugh at, but it destroys a lot of families. It destroys.
Sure.
So we had this one guy. Have you interviewed Bob Alderman yet?
No.
You got to interview Bob Alderman. Grew up in a tough white neighborhood in Columbus, Ohio. Was an Allen County Sheriff's deputy. Greatest guy. I think he was a Marine. And every year, he's another great quote, but every year he would stand up at the State House, and he was an active sheriff's deputy. And he would warn us. He would say, you know what? The FBI has been to every state but Indiana. You know, the last time we had a big investigation was 1980 when the leadership of the Senate all went to prison. But he said, you know, we had Bob Trott in Kentucky. It was a big FBI investigation in the early 90s, late 80s maybe, and over racing dates, fixing of racing dates. And in Tennessee, we had an investigation called Rocky Top, you know, which I don't know what that scandal was all about. But then they took out the state Senate president of Ohio the same day. The FBI has a sense of humor. They took him out. His name was Stanley Aronoff, and they arrested him the same day that the big Performing Arts Center in Cincinnati was named the Aronoff Center was being opened. And they arrested him the day that was his big day.
Yeah.
Of course, that was time. They could have arrested him any day. And then Illinois is routinely corrupt. You know, Mitch Daniels used to always say when a governor of Illinois talks about serving his second term, it's always in Terre Haute, Indiana.
Oh my gosh.
And Holcomb says that when a governor of Illinois gives you his cell number, it's not his phone. But so ultimately get up and say, you guys, everybody be careful. No, don't think the FBI is not here. Mm-hmm. You know, and they were at Moe's sitting at the bar, listening to conversations between lobbyists and legislators. Mm-hmm. And you know, John Keeler's really the first one to go down since 1980. But the other thing Alderman used to do, he was I will say his name because he admits it, but he had girlfriends, and he used to always say, I mean, he was so funny. He would say, I don't know why all these legislators bring their girlfriends to the State House. He said, you know, they're going to get caught. He said, I keep my girlfriends at the Holiday Inn in Beech Grove. Just like, he was, if you knew Bob Alderman, I mean, that was such a typical Bob Alderman. It was just like, God, is he funny. Anyhow, if you get a chance.
Yeah, definitely.
Bob Alderman is worth, I mean, if you had to drive to Fort Wayne to see him, he'd be worth it.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I'll definitely have
He's like Jeff Linder. I mean, they're just off the charts funny. And that's the other thing that's happened is the legislative process has become so homogenized, the personalities have gone away. There was a guy, I wish he was still alive for your interview, his name was Dale Sturts, was the LaGrange County Sheriff, probably weighed 300 pounds, maybe 350. He kept a 44 Magnum in his desk, I mean, like the Clint Eastwood gun.
Wow.
And it would take him like 10 minutes to walk up to the front of the, but he was so funny. One time there was a guy named Bill Ruppel, who was from Manchester, and he was a farmer, and he was tired of dirt bikes kicking up dust on the dirt roads. Mm-hmm. And so he wanted to make it a state law, make it illegal to pop a wheelie on a motorcycle. And he was serious. I mean, he was... So Dale Sturp walks up to the front, and Dale Sturp's one of these guys who always kind of look down over the top of his glasses. And he's a big guy. And he very slowly says, well, you have heard of Evel Knievel? He said, this is stupid Canupid. And the place goes nuts laughing. And Bill Ruppel stood there and cried and cried and cried. You know, people were making fun of his bill. And later, I was at Dale Sturtz's house one time, and he said, you know, I really felt bad that I made Bill Ruppel cry.
Oh my God.
I wish he were still alive. He was there were so many characters. But what I'm saying is there's very few characters left.
Right.
Everybody's gotten so, you know, it's just homogenized, is the way to put it.
Yeah.
We used to have some funny people.
Interesting. What, in your opinion, is the most important work of the Indiana General Assembly?
Well, number one, I mean, the only job they have to do is the budget, right? So they have to do the budget. I think number two would be public education. Trying to, and I feel so sorry for teachers. I was on the education committee one time. They change the rules every 2 years. I don't know how any teacher or administrator keeps up with the rules because they change constantly. There's no long view of education. So there's no, let's try this, let's give it 8 years work. Oh God, no. They change the rules every 2 or 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so the teachers and administrators are getting whipsawed constantly. Like, oh, we have to do this, now we have to do this, now we have to do this, now we have to do this. And they never have a chance to see if anything works, in my opinion. And so I think common sense, trusting, you have school boards, trusting the school boards to do what's right. I was a big opponent of, No Child Left Behind at the federal level.
Mm-hmm.
Even though I obviously didn't have a vote, I thought it was the federal government usurping state responsibility and state and local responsibility. So public education. But because I'm a anti-regulation Republican, I'd say the third is allowing free markets to work.
Mm-hmm.
And that is getting out of the way of the free market. And I think the telecom deregulation bill proved that getting out of the way of the free market works in the end for everybody. It should be, that approach should be taken more universally, I think. When in doubt, don't pass a law.
Yeah. How do you think the state of Indiana has changed over time?
Oh, hugely. Of course, it depends how far you want to go back, but I talked about racism, we're one of the most racist states in the country for a long time. There's still some towns that, rightly or wrongly, have that reputation. You always think of the most racist towns as being Elwood and Martinsville, right? And they'll never get rid of their reputation. Elwood was where some of the last lynchings occurred, and Martinsville was where a young black girl was in Martinsville selling Girl Scout cookies in a very white town and disappeared and later found dead and all that. And now the Martinsville people say she was not killed by somebody from Martinsville. She was killed by somebody who was going through Martinsville. That's their defense. Who knows? Ralph Foley could tell you more about that. But so it depends how far you want to go back. But since in my time in the legislature, starting with the Gingrich revolution, well, first of all, there were times when the Republicans controlled 70 seats earlier, right? But then Watergate flipped that. 1974 election flipped that. So all of a sudden it was heavily Democrat. And that lasted for a while. But the other big flip was in 94 during the Gingrich Revolution. And what you've seen over time, and John Gregg talked about this, I was at a dinner with him Friday night, and he said it was very difficult to find a Republican in southern Indiana. Now it's very difficult to find a Democrat. He said, I'm like a museum piece now. I was the Democratic Speaker of the House from Sanborn, which is Knox County. And you go to Davies County, talk to Dave Crooks sometime. He was a legislator from Washington, Indiana, and was a good legislator, owns radio stations and things down there. And he said, there's like no Democratic office holders in Davies County anymore. It used to be a core of Democratic strength was Davies County. So it's all the legislators along the Ohio River used to be Democrats. They're all Republicans now, for the most part. And so southern Indiana. Now, we always say that Democrats in Indiana are like Republicans in the East Coast. I mean, they're not really Democrats. They're not really, they're certainly not California Democrats.
Right.
And so, but that has just become more and more prevalent over the years. Rarely could we get a Republican legislator from South Bend. Now we have a Republican legislator, at least one or two from South Bend. We couldn't. We've won parts of Lake County. The mayor of Terre Haute for several years now, I think, has been a Republican, and that's all happened in the last 30 years. Johnson County, one of the most Republican counties in the state, over about a 30-year period. Now, some of it's migration in of suburbanites, right, or people becoming suburbanites. But Johnson County for 100 and some years was a very Democratic county. Now it's hard to find a Democrat in Johnson County. So, but on the flip side, now you're getting some Democratic office holders in Hamilton County for the first time in many, many, many years.
Interesting.
Also, in my time in the legislature, Unigov, city government in Indianapolis was solidly Republican.
Yeah.
Now it's solidly Democrat. So there's all kinds of reasons for that, but
Right.
I think that's the biggest change, is the change in the red versus blues, the map
Mm-hmm.
from red to blue has changed dramatically in the state compared to, say, 1990.
Mm-hmm. Let's see, final question though. What do you want the people of Indiana to know about their influence on the Indiana General Assembly?
They can make a difference. One person can change the world.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you want to get the the most impactful government is at the lowest level. So people who run for a school board have a greater influence on their neighborhoods and the lives of the families of the people around them than anything, than legislature, than Congress, than city council, than anything. So if you really want to have an impact, run for the school board. You also learn a lot too. But I think one person can make a difference, and we see it all the time. There was a lady, this is during the Bayh administration, there used to be a rule that county hospitals didn't have to have a doctor on duty all the time. They couldn't afford it. And my memory tells me she's from somewhere near Columbus, but her husband died of a heart attack. She got to the hospital and there was no doctor there. And so she slept on a bench in the State House for God knows how many days or weeks or whatever. Evan Bayh finally had her arrested. And she said she wasn't leaving the State House until they passed a rule or a law that said every hospital had to have a doctor on duty 24 hours a day. Which to me and you, it'd be like common sense, but it wasn't the case in the early 90s.
Yeah.
She made a difference. You see that all the time. Unfortunately, it takes a tragic individual story or a grieving parent or somebody to come to the State House. But the one story I always tell young people about one person making a difference is there's nothing to do with Indiana, but universally. My son's graduation from Vanderbilt, there was a guy there named Muhammad Yunus, and he looked like Jesus or Moses. I mean, he had the long white robe and the long beard. I guess more like Moses than Jesus. But he was from Bangladesh, and he was getting his PhD in economics in Vanderbilt when the whole Bangladesh was splitting off from East Pakistan.
Yeah.
All that stuff was going on. And he was part of like a government exile, and he went back to Bangladesh, and he said he started talking to people in his old village, and everybody was in such debt to the loan sharks, and it was kind of a matriarchal society, I think, at the time. And so he said that he went to the loan sharks and said, why don't you loan these people money so they can grow their rice and do their things and without 90% interest rates and things like that. He said, because they don't have any collateral. And he said, well, how much is the debt? And the entire village's debt was $42 American. And he took $42 out of his pocket and said, here, the village's debt's paid off. And then he decided he was going to help these people. He started the Grameen Bank, which is legendary. And he wrote a book called Banker to the Poor, which you ought to read if you had a chance. And the Grameen Bank would loan women money to buy rice. And this shows you my lack of agriculture now. Rice seeds, rice shoots, whatever to do.
Right.
To buy materials so they could make clothes and sell them, to do all the things that they could do to feed their families. And he did it based on their signature only. And when he spoke to my son's graduation, he said, I now have 6.7 million members of my bank. He said, 97% of my customers are women, and the payoff rate without any collateral is 99%. And he said the average loan is $100, but $100 makes a difference. And he said, all I did was ask questions. And he said, I would ask questions, and then when I got an answer, that would lead to other questions, which would lead to other answers, and I kept snowballing until I came up with the Grameen Bank. And he's made it huge. He won the Nobel Peace Prize for this.
Wow.
And he said, you can do that here. One person, I didn't have any money, it wasn't a special person, I had $42 in my pocket, in a brain. And he said, anybody can change the world. And so They actually brought the Grameen Bank here, I think in Indianapolis and Arkansas maybe at one point during the Clinton administration. And I don't know anything about how the Arkansas thing went, but here in Indianapolis it didn't last, because what they did was they got lazy and they tried to make everybody literally become a Mary Kay salesman. And that was their way to lift people up, which kind of bullshit, frankly.
Yeah.
Go sell Amway, you'll be rich.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
But, so one person can make a difference, and you see it, you don't see it often, but you see it, and a lot of times when it does happen, it never gets any publicity. But I'd say to everybody, boy, girl, Democrat, Republican, because everybody comes there for a reason.
Yep.
Some of them were very impactful, some of them are not. I had a friend of mine, Rich McLean, who's from Logansport, he was an inventor.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
And the nicest man you ever meet. And he sat there, and all he ever did was smile and push the green or red button. And he had been there 12 years. He came in the same day I did and left the same day. So he was there 16 years like I was. And he had never spoken at the microphone in 12 years. Never pushed any. He voted, right? Voted the Republican way, as we used to say, right? And one time he got up to introduce some friends that came in from out of town. And just as a joke, Bosma was the speaker. I said, "Mr. Speaker, point of information." And he goes, "Okay, what's your point?" And I said, "Would you please have the gentleman at the microphone introduce himself?" Because the place just went nuts laughing because he had never spoken at the microphone.
That's funny.
So he didn't have much of an impact. Nice guy. He was called the Squeezer because he was a little inventor. And he invented a thing to put on the end of your toothpaste tube that you just push it up. It had these like tight rubber band kind of things that were stronger than rubber bands and two plastic bars.
Yeah.
And you'd pull it apart just enough to get it over the back end of your toothpaste, and then you'd slowly push it up so you wouldn't waste toothpaste. And he had his name, State Rep Rich McLean.
That's funny.
He had to hand them out all over the place.
Yeah.
His nickname in the State House was the Squeezer.
Yeah, I interviewed him not too long ago, actually, but I didn't know about that.
He's the nicest guy. His wife's name was Barry, and he voted a little bit moderate on education because she was a teachers union member, and her dad would always finance his campaigns. He never had to raise a lot of money or anything.
Yeah.
What a great guy, though.
That's funny.
I haven't seen him in years.
Thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah.